The morning Evelyn Carter arrived at the Hayes Ranch, the sky was the color of old pewter, and a wind had been cutting across the flatlands since before sunrise, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and something colder underneath. The smell of a place that had gone too long without warmth. She came in a borrowed wagon, the only one heading out that direction from Mill Haven. The driver, a heavy-set man named Decker, who ran the feed supply at the edge of town, had not said more than 4 words the entire ride. He'd taken her coin and pointed at the bench seat, and that was the extent of their arrangement. Evelyn didn't mind. She'd learned a long time ago that silence from a stranger was easier to manage than pity, and Decker's particular silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require anything from her. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her one good bag wedged between her feet, and she watched the land open up on either side of the track like something being slowly unrolled. It was big country. Bigger than she'd expected, and she had expected something substantial. The Clearwater Valley had a reputation that reached as far as Harlan, where she'd come from. A reputation built mostly on the name Hayes, the way most reputations in frontier valleys were built on a single family that had been there long enough and worked hard enough and accumulated enough that their name became shorthand for the land itself. Colton Hayes. She'd heard the name spoken in 4 different tones across as many months. Respectfully, by the banker in Harlan who'd suggested the position. Carefully, by the woman at the post office who'd processed the job listing. Nervously, by the 2 women in the dry goods store who'd lowered their voices when they mentioned the children. And flatly, the way people speak about things they've given up trying to understand, by Margaret Doyle, who'd held the housekeeping position before Evelyn and who'd lasted 11 days before walking back into Mill Haven on foot, carrying her bag and not looking back. 7 children, Margaret had said, sitting across from Evelyn in the cramped boarding house where they'd briefly overlapped. 7. The oldest is 16 and she'll look straight through you like you're made of window glass. The youngest isn't yet 4, and she cried every night I was there, every single night, and nobody came. Nobody. Not the father, not the older children, nobody. She'd paused and looked at Evelyn with the particular weariness of someone who'd tried and failed at something they weren't ashamed of failing at. He doesn't speak to them, you understand? He's there. He eats at the same table, he walks the same halls, but he's not there. That man left when his wife did, and whatever's walking around the ranch with his name on it is just a very expensive ghost. Evelyn had listened to all of it. She'd said thank you and meant it, and then she'd taken the job anyway. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now the wagon hit a rut in the track, and her bag shifted, and she caught it with one hand without thinking, and ahead of them, finally, the Hayes property came into view. It was not what she'd imagined, or rather, it was more than she'd imagined, and the more was the part that gave her pause. The main house sat at the top of a long slope, 2 stories of pale timber and dark stone, built wide rather than tall the way houses were built out here, when the people who built them intended to stay. There were outbuildings behind it. A barn, what looked like a bunkhouse, storage sheds, and fencing that ran in clean lines out toward grazing land, where a scatter of cattle moved in the early morning light like dark shapes on a gray cloth. It was a prosperous place. It had the look of something that had been carefully and deliberately made. But as the wagon came closer, she noticed the things that cut against that first impression. A gate hinge on the left side of the entrance was rusted, and the gate itself hung at a slight angle, the way a gate hangs when no one has bothered to fix it for a season or 2. The flower beds along the front of the house, which had clearly been planted with intention at some point, were overgrown and gone to seed. One window on the upper floor had a crack running diagonal across the lower pane, patched roughly with oilcloth from the inside. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulate when a household is running on duty rather than care. Decker pulled up into the front of the house, and she climbed down before he could decide whether to help her. Her boots hit the hard ground, and she took her bag from the bed of the wagon, and he tipped his hat once and turned the horses without a word. She stood in front of the house for a moment. There was no one to meet her. She had sent a letter with her arrival date. She'd received a reply, terse, 2 lines, in handwriting that was more functional than elegant, confirming the date and instructing her to come to the front door. She stood at the front door now and knocked. Nothing for a long moment. Then the sound of feet, small, quick feet, and the door was pulled open from the inside to reveal a girl of perhaps 8 years old with dark hair that needed brushing and eyes that were the exact sharp green of creek water in summer. The girl looked at her with neither welcome nor hostility, just the flat, careful assessment of a child who had learned to take stock of new adults before committing to any particular reaction. "You're the new housekeeper," the girl said. "I am. Evelyn Carter." She kept her voice level. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Nice to meet you, Clara. Is your father home?" The girl's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. Something behind the assessment. "He's in the East Study. He said to tell whoever came that Mrs. Greer would show you around." She paused. "But Mrs. Greer doesn't get here until 9. It's 7:30. "That's fine. Can I come in?" Clara considered this with a seriousness that would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so obviously genuine. Then she stepped back from the door. The inside of the house was dim, the curtains in the entry hall still drawn against the morning. It smelled of wood smoke and something stale underneath. The smell of rooms that were heated but not aired, lived in but not tended to. A wide staircase rose from the entry hall to the upper floor, and from somewhere up there came the sound of voices. Low, not quite arguing, the kind of voices that were keeping themselves quiet because they didn't want to be heard. "The others are upstairs," Clara said, apparently reading her attention. "Nate and Thomas are fighting again. They do that every morning." She said it without any particular emotion, the way someone reports on the weather. "How many of you are there, total?" 7. The girl looked at her steadily. "Everyone says that like it's a warning." Evelyn looked back at her, this 8-year-old with her creek green eyes and her careful face, and felt something settle in her chest. Not sympathy, exactly, which could tip over into condescension, but something more like recognition. She knew what it was to grow up having to be too old for your age. She knew what it cost. "I don't think it's a warning," Evelyn said. 7's just a number." Clara looked at her for another moment. Then, with the smallest possible movement, something in her face eased. "The kitchen's at the back of the house," she said. "I'll show you." The kitchen was large, which was a mercy, and it had been designed by someone who understood cooking rather than just owned a stove. There was a cast iron range along the back wall, a long work table in the center, a larder with a door that latched properly, and windows on the east wall that would catch the morning light once the curtains were opened. The curtains were not open. Evelyn opened them while Clara watched from the doorway. "Mrs. Greer keeps them closed," Clara said. "Why?" "She says the sun fades the fabric." Evelyn looked at the curtains. They were plain cotton, serviceable, not worth preserving over light. "What time does everyone eat breakfast?" "We don't. Not together." Clara leaned against the doorframe. "Everyone just comes down when they want and gets what they can find. Mrs. Greer leaves bread out sometimes." Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She opened the larder and took stock. Flour, salt, a ham that was toward the end of its life but still good, a crock of lard, dried beans, eggs, a dozen at least. More than enough. "Is there coffee?" she asked. "Top shelf. Papa drinks it, but there's extra." She found the coffee and set it on the range with water from the pitcher on the counter. While it heated, she found a skillet and cut slices from the ham and cracked 4 eggs and then thought about it and cracked 4 more. The smell of it, ham fat in a hot pan, salt, the beginning of coffee, reached into the kitchen, and she heard, after a few minutes, the sound of feet on the stairs. More than one pair. By the time the coffee was ready, she had a second skillet going with the eggs, toast coming off a long fork held over the open range damper, and the ham sliced and laid out on a platter. She heard the voices stop in the hallway outside the kitchen. Then the door opened. 2 boys, maybe 11 and 13, arrived first. She guessed these were Nate and Thomas, though she'd not yet been told which was which. They stopped in the doorway exactly as Clara had, and they looked at the food on the stove and then at her and then at each other. "Sit down," she said pleasantly. "It's almost ready." "Mrs. Greer doesn't cook breakfast," the older-looking one said. "I do." She set plates on the table without making more of it than that. 3 more children arrived in the next 5 minutes. A girl of about 12, who moved with the contained, deliberate energy of someone who had appointed herself responsible for something. A boy of maybe 6 who came in holding the hand of the youngest. The small one who, if Evelyn was counting right, was the one Margaret Doyle had said cried every night without anyone coming. The baby. She was not quite a baby, closer to 3 or almost 4, with brown hair and a rough braid that was coming undone, and cheeks that were still soft with that particular roundness that children lose somewhere between 4 and 5, came to the edge of the table and looked up at the food, and then looked up at Evelyn. "You made eggs," the little one said. "I did. Scrambled. Do you like scrambled?" The child nodded seriously. Evelyn lifted her up onto the bench without asking permission and set a small plate in front of her, and the child looked at it for a moment and then picked up the fork. The 12-year-old, who had been watching all of this from the doorway with an expression that was more complicated than any 12-year-old's expression had a right to be, came slowly to the table and sat. "I'm Harriet," she said, in a tone that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, just informational. "Evelyn Carter. You're the 7th housekeeper." "8th," Clara said from her seat next to the youngest. Harriet looked at Clara. "7th. Mrs. Aldous didn't count. She left after 1 day." "That still counts." "Doesn't." "I'm not going to leave after 1 day," Evelyn said mildly, and both girls looked at her. Harriet with skepticism, Clara with the careful neutrality she seemed to apply to everything. "I'm not going to leave at all, if it comes to that, so the count doesn't matter much either way." The oldest boy, Nate or Thomas, snorted. "That's what they all say." "Maybe." She sat down at the end of the table with her own plate and her cup of coffee. "Eat before it gets cold." They ate. It was not comfortable, exactly. There was too much wariness in the room for comfort, too much held breath. But it was something. The food was hot, and the kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house, and for a little while the only sounds were forks on plates, and the creak of the bench under shifting weight, and the youngest child, whose name she would learn was Rose, making small, contented sounds over her scrambled eggs. The 7th child, the oldest, did not come down. Asiwaspam. She met Mrs. Greer at 9 o'clock, as promised. Agnes Greer was a compact, efficient woman in her late 50s who had been managing the day-to-day logistics of the Hayes household for 8 months. Not as a housekeeper, she was careful to specify, but as a household coordinator, which seemed to mean she managed the accounts, directed the twice-weekly cleaning woman, and ensured the pantry was stocked. She had the look of someone who had found a way to do her job without engaging with the emotional climate of the house, which Evelyn supposed was a reasonable adaptation. "The children are manageable if you don't expect conversation," Mrs. Greer said, moving through the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of someone who spent as little time in it as possible. "The older ones particularly. Harriet has taken on more responsibility than is appropriate for her age, and she'll resent you inserting yourself into that dynamic." She paused and looked at the clean skillet drying on the rack by the range. "You cooked this morning?" "Breakfast. A brief assessment. Mr. Hayes takes his meals in the study most days. He prefers not to be disturbed before 10 o'clock. If he requires something, he'll ring for it." She said it with the careful neutrality of someone describing a condition they'd made their peace with. "Does he eat with the children at all?" The briefest pause. "He has dinner with them on Sundays." "Every Sunday?" "Most Sundays." Evelyn nodded. She did not push it further. There would be time. Mrs. Greer showed her the rest of the house, which was organized and clean in the surface sense, but had the particular unlived feeling of rooms that were maintained rather than inhabited. The parlor had furniture that was good quality and stiffly arranged, as if no one sat in it. The dining room had a table that could seat 12, and was set for 2 on one end and 5 on the other, children's side and adults' side, which struck her as an arrangement that required more effort than simply setting a single table. The upstairs hallway had 6 bedroom doors, 5 of which she was shown. The 6th was at the end of the hall. "That's Miss Louise's room," Mrs. Greer said. "She manages her own arrangements. I would suggest leaving her to it, at least at first." "How old is she?" 16. Another pause. It has been difficult, for her particularly. She was very close with her mother." "When did Mrs. Hayes pass?" Mrs. Greer straightened a picture on the hallway wall that didn't need straightening. 2.5 years ago. Fever, it came quickly. She moved toward the stairs. "I'll show you your room." Her room was small, at the back of the house on the ground floor, near the kitchen. It had a single window, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the back of the door. It was clean and cold. She set her bag down and looked at the window, which faced out toward the barn and the pasture beyond. 2.5 years. 7 children and a father who had retreated so far inside his grief that he couldn't get through a Sunday dinner most weeks. She thought about what it must have been like for Harriet, the 12-year-old with the 2 old eyes, holding the house together by sheer force of will because someone had to. She thought about Rose, the youngest, crying every night. She unpacked her bag. It didn't take long. She hadn't come with much. She did not meet Colton Hayes until the afternoon. She had spent the morning learning the rhythms of the house, where things were kept, what needed to be done, and in what order. The particular calibration of the temperamental range that ran too hot on the left side and needed to be fed smaller pieces of wood to avoid scorching. She had spoken briefly with the ranch foreman, a weathered man named Gil Hutchins, who'd come to the kitchen door to ask about the supply order and had looked surprised to find someone who could answer his questions. "You the new housekeeper?" he'd asked, with the same manner she was beginning to recognize. Not unfriendly, but testing the ground before committing weight to it. "Evelyn Carter?" "Gil Hutchins. I run the cattle operation." He leaned in the doorway. "You staying?" "I expect so." He'd looked at her for a moment with the evaluating squint of a man who spent his days assessing things. Weather, livestock, terrain. "Good," he'd said finally, and meant it. "The kids need somebody who'll stay." She was in the study corridor at 2:30 in the afternoon, carrying a tray with coffee and the last of the bread she'd made that morning. She had noted, in her tour of the house, that the East study was not on Mrs. Greer's daily rounds. When the door opened and Colton Hayes walked out, she had tried not to form a picture of him ahead of time. She had mostly failed. The man in her head had been formed from pieces: Margaret Doyle's description, the brief functional handwriting of his letter, the particular quality of absence she'd felt in the house all morning. She had expected someone diminished, someone worn thin by grief and turned inward. Colton Hayes was not that. He was a tall man, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of physical solidity that came not from effort, but from decades of hard outdoor work. He was probably 40 or near enough, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that was several days past a shave. He wore work clothes, not the clothes of a man receiving visitors, which told her something. Either he hadn't expected her, or he'd forgotten she was coming, or he had, and it hadn't registered as significant enough to dress for. He had a ledger in one hand, and his eyes were on it when he came through the door, and he almost walked into her. He stopped short, looked up. Dark eyes. The kind of eyes that had once, she thought, been quick and engaged and were now set behind something. Not coldness exactly, but distance. The way a lamp looks from across a field. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Evelyn Carter. I started this morning." He looked at her, then at the tray. "Mrs. Greer usually handles—" "Mrs. Greer doesn't come to this corridor, see?" Evelyn said pleasantly. "I noticed you hadn't eaten." A pause. It was the particular pause of a man who was not accustomed to being noticed in his own house, which was its own strange kind of information. "I'm fine," he said. "The coffee's fresh." Another pause. Then, not agreeing exactly, but not dismissing either. "Leave it at the door." "Of course." She set the tray on the small table by the study door that was clearly there for this purpose. She straightened. "The children had breakfast together this morning. I'm planning a proper dinner at the main table tonight, if that suits you." Something moved in his face. It was difficult to read, less an expression than the ghost of one. "Mrs. Greer manages the—" "Mrs. Greer has been very helpful with the accounts and the supply orders," Evelyn said. "I'll be handling the meals and the household from here. Dinner at 6, if that works." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look, not aggressively, not with any particular challenge in it, just steadily. "6 is fine," he said finally. "Thank you." She turned to go, then paused. "The window in the upper hall has a crack in it. I'll get it measured tomorrow so we can get a new pane ordered. And the east gate hinge needs replacing. I'll ask Mr. Hutchins if he has the hardware." She did not wait for a response. She walked back toward the kitchen, and behind her she heard, after a moment, the sound of him picking up the coffee cup from the tray. Dinner that evening was not a success in any conventional sense. It was not a disaster, either, which she counted as progress. She cooked a proper meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots from the root cellar, biscuits that had come out better than she'd expected given the oven's eccentricities. She set the main dining table, not in the divided configuration she'd found it in that morning, but fully, all settings together, one table rather than two factions of one. 6 of the 7 children came down. Rose she carried herself, the little girl heavy-limbed with sleepiness and smelling of the soap Evelyn had used to wash her hair that afternoon. She had found the child sitting in the dirt behind the house in the cold, and that had seemed like sufficient reason for a bath, which Rose had endured with the solemn resignation of a small person who understood that some things were just going to happen. The one who did not come was Louisa. Evelyn sent Harriet upstairs to knock on the door. Harriet came back 2 minutes later with the expression of someone who had completed an assignment they'd known was pointless. She said she's not hungry. Evelyn made no comment. She served the food. Colton Hayes came to the table at 6 o'clock. He sat at the head of it. She had set his place at the head, which she suspected had not been his habit recently, and for a moment she thought he was going to redirect himself to the study, but he sat. He looked at the table, at the food, at the arrangement of his children around him. Thomas, she had sorted out the names by now, Thomas being 13 and the more volatile of the 2 older boys, Nate being 11 and quieter, said in the tone of someone testing a hypothesis, "You changed the table." "I did," Evelyn said. "We used to sit at the other end. Now you sit here." She passed him the potatoes. "All together." Colton said nothing. He served himself from the platter she offered him, and he ate, and the children ate, and the dinner was not easy or comfortable. There were silences that had weight to them, and Thomas knocked over his cup, and Harriet's jaw tightened, and Clara watched everything with those careful eyes. But it was a dinner, a real one, at a real table, with the family together. At some point during the meal, Rose, who had been sitting beside her father without acknowledging him, she had learned, Evelyn thought, not to reach for things she hadn't been given, dropped her fork and it clattered off the edge of the table onto the floor. She looked at it. Then she looked up at her father. "Papa," she said. It was the first word Evelyn had heard any of them direct at him. Colton Hayes looked down at his youngest child. Something crossed his face that was too complex to name. Not just grief, though grief was in it, but something that had been waiting behind the grief, pressing against it. He bent down and picked up the fork. He handed it back to Rose. "Be more careful," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd probably intended. Rose took the fork. "Thank you, Papa," she said, very small. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he went back to his plate. After dinner, when the children had scattered, and Mrs. Greer had long since gone home, and the house had settled into its night sounds, Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink washing the dishes and heard footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside the kitchen door. Then Colton Hayes said from the other side of it, "The chicken was good." She kept washing. "Glad to hear it." A pause. "Mrs. Greer said you opened the kitchen curtains." "The east windows. The morning light helps in a kitchen." Another pause. Longer. "My wife used to open them," he said. And then, as if he hadn't said it, "Good night, Miss Carter." "Good night, Mr. Hayes." She heard him walk away. She stood at the sink with her hands in the warm water and looked at the dark window and the reflection of the lamp in it, and outside, beyond the reflection, the vast and lightless dark of the Clearwater Valley, lying under a sky that had cleared to hard, cold stars. One day, she thought, that was something. The days that followed were not easy, but they had a shape to them, which was its own kind of forward motion. She learned the children the way she learned any new territory, carefully, with attention to what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. Thomas, the 13-year-old, was angry in the specific way of boys who needed something they couldn't name. He picked fights with Nate because Nate was available, and he tested Evelyn constantly in small ways, and she let him test without either caving or escalating. Nate was quieter and sadder, more liable to disappear to the barn with Gil's tacit permission than to make noise about whatever was eating at him. Clara, the 8-year-old with the green eyes, had attached herself to Evelyn with a careful, provisional quality, never demanding, never assuming, but present, watchful, slowly extending trust the way a plant extends toward a new source of light. The girl of 12, Harriet, was the hardest. Not because she was unkind, she was not unkind. But Harriet had been running this household in every way that mattered for 2.5 years, and she was 12, and the weight of that showed in the way she held herself, always slightly braced, and in the way she watched Evelyn take over the kitchen and the schedules and the management of the younger children with a guardedness that was entirely earned. "You don't need to do the laundry schedule," Evelyn told her one afternoon in the second week, when she found Harriet with the ledger where she'd been tracking which children needed what and when. "I've got it." Harriet looked up from the ledger. "I've been doing it since—" "I know, and you did a good job." She sat down across from her. "But you're 12 years old, and it shouldn't have been your job to begin with, and now it's mine. And what I'm saying is, you can put down the ledger." Harriet looked at her for a long moment. "What if you leave?" Evelyn held the look. "I'm not going to leave, Harriet." "You don't know that." "I do know that." "How?" It was a fair question. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because I've got nowhere else to go that I'd rather be," she said. "And because these kids need someone to stay, and I'm not a person who walks away from a thing that needs doing." Harriet was quiet. Then she put the ledger down on the table between them, not handing it over exactly, more like releasing it, a provisional release. "Rose still cries at night sometimes," she said. "She has since Mama died. Nobody tells Papa." "I know. I hear her." She paused. "I go to her." Something shifted in Harriet's face. Not the full easing of a thing held too long, but a beginning of it. "She doesn't like to be left in the dark," she said. "She needs someone to stay until she's asleep again." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "I've stayed." Harriet looked at her. Then she picked up her school book, which had been sitting at the other end of the table, and she opened it and bent over it with the focused attention of a girl who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that it was acceptable to be 12 again, for a little while. The first real conversation with Louisa happened in the third week, and it happened because Evelyn stopped trying to make it happen. She had been leaving a plate at the girl's door every evening, not knocking, not announcing herself, just setting it down and walking away. Most mornings the plate was empty and back in the hall. On the 9th day, she came down the upper corridor with the evening plate and found Louisa sitting on the floor in the hallway with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, reading a book by the light from the window at the end of the hall. Evelyn set the plate down. She started to turn. "You don't have to do that," Louisa said, without looking up from the book. "Leave food." "I know." "The others don't get room service." "The others come to the kitchen." Evelyn leaned against the wall opposite her. "You're welcome to do the same." Louisa turned a page. She was 16 and she had her father's build, tall, contained, and her mother's coloring, Evelyn guessed, though she'd seen no photographs. She was not a soft-looking girl. There was something precise and guarded about her, like an instrument kept in a case. "You're still here," she said. "The last 3 didn't make it past 2 weeks." "I'm aware." "You cook breakfast." A pause. "I can smell it in the morning." "Do you want some?" "No." "All right." Louisa finally looked up. Dark eyes, like her father's, but alert where his were distant. "What do you want from us?" she asked. It was a direct question, and there was nothing rude in it, just the directness of someone who had been disappointed enough times to stop approaching things obliquely. "Nothing you don't want to give," Evelyn said. "That's not an answer. Not an—" "No," Evelyn agreed. "I want the younger ones to be all right. I want your father to remember that he has children who are still alive. I want this house to be a home again instead of a very big box that everyone's hiding inside." She paused. "And I'd like to know you eventually, if that's something you'd allow." Louisa looked at her for a long moment, something in her face, not softening, not exactly, but reassessing. "Mama used to read out here," she said, "in this hallway in the evenings. The light's good." "It is good," Evelyn agreed. "I'm not ready to come to dinner." "That's fine. I don't know. Maybe some mornings." She looked back at her book. "I'll have coffee ready at 7, Evelyn said. "If you want it." She walked back down the hall. Behind her, she heard the sound of Louisa turning another page. The valley was not just land. She understood that better as the weeks went on. She had occasion, through Gil Hutchins, and through the small exchanges that happened when she drove the supply wagon into Mill Haven, to understand the landscape of the Clearwater Valley in the way that mattered most out here. the political and economic landscape, the web of debt and dependency and influence that determined who thrived and who survived and who did neither. And at the center of that web, as near as she could make out, was a name: Veronica Hale. She heard it for the first time from the wife of a small rancher named Peters, who'd come to the Hayes yard gate to return a borrowed tool and had stayed to talk. The woman, Ruth Peters, sunburned and capable-looking, had spoken of Veronica Hale the way people speak of weather systems, as something that exists in a category beyond ordinary cause and effect. "She's got paper on half the ranches in the valley," Ruth had said. "Loans, lease arrangements, supply contracts. The Hendersons can't sell their cattle without going through her buyer network. The Garcias have been on a Hale lease for 6 years. They think they're buying it, but the terms keep changing." She'd shaken her head. "Even Hayes, even with all he's got, she's careful around him. He's the one person in the valley she hasn't been able to wrap up in paper." "What does she want?" Evelyn had asked. Ruth had looked at her with the expression of someone who thought the answer was obvious. "All of it," she'd said. "The whole valley. She's been buying it up piece by piece for 15 years. Evelyn had thought about that on the drive back to the ranch. She'd thought about it while she made dinner and while she helped Rose with her evening bath, and while she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her. She was not naive about what she was seeing: a valley full of families who were productive and capable, and who were being systematically stripped of independence through debt they'd taken on in hard years, through supply arrangements that locked them to Hale prices, through lease structures that looked like ownership but weren't. It was patient work, methodical, the kind of thing that took years and required the particular skill of making people feel they had choices when they didn't. She thought about the Peters family, and the Hendersons and the Garcias. She thought about what it would mean to break that network, not through confrontation, not at first, but through the simple practical countermeasure of those families choosing to work together rather than separately, share resources, negotiate as a group rather than as individuals. She thought about Colton Hayes, who had the land and the capital and the reputation to anchor such an arrangement, if he could be moved to see beyond the edges of his own grief. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. One thing at a time, she told herself, one thing at a time. First the children, then the family, then, maybe, the valley. Folk. On a Sunday in the 4th week, Colton Hayes came to dinner without being called. He came at 6 o'clock, when he heard the noise of the children gathering. They were louder now, at dinner, in the way that children become louder when they begin to feel safer. And he walked in and sat down at the head of the table and looked at the food she had made, and at the faces of his 7 children around him. Louisa was there. She had come for the first time the previous Sunday, sitting at the far end of the table and speaking to no one and eating with the precise, careful movements of someone who had decided to be present but not yet to participate. And she was there again now, in the same seat. And when her father sat down, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them, complicated and unresolved, the way most important things between people are, and neither of them spoke. Thomas said, "The Mercer boys got a new horse." And Colton said, without thinking about it, the way a man responds when something engages him before he's remembered to stay distant, "What kind?" And Thomas, surprised into animation, said, "Quarter horse, Papa, a big bay. Gil says it's good stock." And they talked about the horse, and Nate joined in, and Clara asked a question about whether horses could understand what you said to them, and Colton, without quite knowing he was doing it, started to answer her. Evelyn served the meal and kept herself quiet and watched the table, this imperfect and broken and slowly mending family, and she thought, there it is, there it is. Rose, at some point in the meal, climbed off her bench without asking and wedged herself into the narrow space between her father's chair and the edge of the table and leaned against his arm. He went very still. Then, slowly he moved his arm and put it around her, and she settled against his side and went on eating her dinner with the peaceful self-possession of a small child who had reclaimed a thing she'd needed a long time. Evelyn looked down at her own plate. One thing at a time, she'd told herself. But there were 7 children around this table, and they were all still here, and so was she. And something had shifted in the Clearwater Valley that had not been there 5 weeks ago, something like a beginning, something like ground being cleared. Whatever came next would come. She would be here for it. The spring came to the Clearwater Valley the way it always did, not all at once, but in pieces, one warm afternoon followed by 3 cold mornings, the ground softening and refreezing in cycles until finally the frost retreated for good and the grass came in green and the creek at the east edge of the Hayes property ran high and fast with snowmelt. It was the kind of spring that reminded people why they'd chosen to live out here in the first place, before the winters had worn them down enough to forget. Evelyn had been at the ranch for 6 weeks by then, and the household had changed in ways that were real but still fragile. The way new ice is real but still fragile. You could walk on it, but you kept your weight careful. The children ate together every morning now, which she had come to think of as a small and significant victory. Louisa came down twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and she sat at the table with her siblings, and she ate, and occasionally she spoke, and it was nothing like the easy family tableau that grief counselors in eastern cities might prescribe, but it was real. Thomas had stopped picking fights at breakfast, mostly because Evelyn had given him a job. She'd asked him to split the morning firewood, which was physical and purposeful and gave him somewhere to put the energy that would otherwise go sideways. And he'd taken to it with the focused intensity of a boy who needed to be useful and hadn't been told he was in a while. Nate had started appearing in the kitchen on Saturday mornings to help her with the baking, not because she'd asked, but because he'd wandered in one Saturday and watched, and she'd handed him a bowl without comment. And now it was a habit neither of them mentioned directly. Rose had stopped crying at night. Evelyn did not announce this to anyone. She simply noticed it, one morning around the 5th week, and understood that it was because the child had a person now. A specific person who came when she called, who stayed until she slept, who was there in the morning without explanation or condition. Children didn't need much beyond that, she'd found. They needed someone to show up, reliably, without making it into a negotiation. What was slower and harder, and still far from resolved, was Colton. He came to dinner reliably now. That was something. He had Sunday breakfast with the children, and he asked Thomas about the woodpile, and he'd had a long conversation with Clara one evening about a bird she'd found with an injured wing, which had ended with the bird installed in a box in the barn, and Clara returning to the house with the cautiously jubilant expression of a child who'd been taken seriously. He was present in a way he had not been when Evelyn arrived. But there was a difference between present and returned. Colton Hayes moved through his own house like a man who was still learning to trust that it was still his. Tentative in ways that didn't show up in his face or his voice, but that she caught in the small hesitations, the way he sometimes stopped in a doorway, as if he'd forgotten why he'd come, the way he'd pick up one of Rose's toys from the parlor floor and hold it a moment too long before setting it down somewhere. She didn't push. She had learned with Harriet that the wrong kind of pressure produced the wrong kind of results, and Colton was a man who had more walls than most, built from better material. What she did instead was talk to him about practical things. The gate hinge she'd had replaced, the cracked window, which a glazier from Millhaven had come to fix and had done adequately, if not elegantly, the state of the root cellar, which needed shoring up before the next winter. She brought him information he needed for his own household without attaching anything to it. No expectations, no emotional charge. And she found that he responded to practical conversation the way some people respond to cold water. It woke him up, briefly, brought him into the room in a way that nothing softer quite managed. They talked in the corridor mostly, or at the kitchen door. Rarely inside the kitchen itself, not at first. He maintained a certain distance that she suspected he wasn't entirely aware of, a physical space between himself and things that might ask something of him. The Peters family was by yesterday, she told him one morning, finding him in the corridor with his coffee. Ruth Peters. She mentioned the Hendersons are in trouble with the Hale supply contract. He looked at her. Where'd you hear about the Hale contract? Ruth Peters. She poured her own coffee. Is it true their terms were changed mid-year? A pause. He looked out the window. Veronica Hale doesn't change terms without a reason. Her reason seems to be that she can. He was quiet for a moment. Henderson should talk to his lawyer. He doesn't have one, and the nearest one who isn't already in Hale's pocket is in Fort Graves, which is 60 miles. She set down her coffee. I'm not trying to involve you in anyone else's business. I just thought you should know what's happening in your own valley. She left him there with his coffee and his thoughts. The day she understood how dangerous Veronica Hale actually was came on a Wednesday in the middle of spring, and it came through the least likely source. She had driven the supply wagon into Millhaven for the weekly provisions, and she had been delayed at the dry goods store by a backed-up order, and she'd been sitting on the bench outside the store waiting for it to be sorted when a woman crossed the street toward her with the deliberate directness of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. She was perhaps 50, dressed well, not extravagantly, but with the particular precision of someone for whom clothing was a form of communication. Her hair was silver blonde, done up tightly, and her face was the kind of attractive that had hardened into something else over the years, sharp where it had once been fine. She walked like a woman accustomed to having space made for her, and the two men she passed on the boardwalk did make space, though Evelyn suspected they would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly why. "Miss Carter," the woman said, stopping in front of her. Evelyn looked up. "You have me at a disadvantage." Veronica Hale. A small, social smile. Not warm. "I own the Hale commercial concern. We've been supplying the Hayes Ranch for several years." "I know who you are," Evelyn said. Something shifted in Hale's expression. The smile remained, but adjusted, recalibrated. "Then you know I have a long-standing relationship with the Hayes property. I wanted to introduce myself and offer my assistance to you personally if you find yourself needing guidance about the valley." It was smoothly done, generous on the surface, and underneath it something she could feel but not yet prove. The pressure of someone assessing a new variable. "That's kind of you," Evelyn said. "I think I'm managing." "Of course." Hale looked at her with the attentive focus of someone taking an inventory. "I heard you've been making some changes out there. Cooking meals, reorganizing the household arrangements. The children must appreciate it." "I hope so. Colton Hayes is a private man." A pause, measured. "He values his arrangements as they are. He can be resistant to change, particularly from people who are new to the valley and don't yet understand how things work here." Another pause. "I say that helpfully." "I understand," Evelyn said. "The valley has its own way of doing things, its own relationships, its own networks. Outsiders sometimes misread the dynamics and cause more trouble than they intend." She let that sit a moment. "I've seen it happen. Families get unsettled, business arrangements get disrupted. It tends to come back on whoever stirred things up." Evelyn looked at her. She kept her voice even. "Mrs. Hale, are you warning me about something specific, or is this a general observation?" The smile widened slightly. "Just welcoming you to the valley, Miss Carter." She straightened. "Give my regards to Colton." She walked away. Evelyn sat on the bench and watched her go and felt the particular clarity that comes after a conversation where the real conversation was almost entirely in the spaces between the words. She thought about Ruth Peters and the Henderson family and the Garcia lease. She thought about the word Hale had used. Arrangements. The way she'd said it, carefully, as if it had weight. She picked up her supply list and went back into the store. She told Colton about it that evening, not at the kitchen door this time. She waited until after dinner when the children had gone upstairs and the house had quieted, and she knocked on the study door and he said, "Come in," with the tone of a man who expected no one. He was at the desk with the ranch ledgers, which he seemed to spend a great deal of time with, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone recalibrating. She sat in the chair across the desk without being invited. He would not have invited her, and waiting would have been counterproductive. And she told him about the conversation, plainly and without editorial. He listened. His expression didn't change much during it, but she'd begun to learn the small tells, the slight tension along his jaw when something mattered, the way his eyes went still rather than distant when he was actually thinking rather than retreating. "What exactly did she say?" he asked when she finished. "That outsiders misread dynamics and cause trouble, that it tends to come back on them." "She said that to you directly?" "In so many words." He looked at the ledger on his desk without seeing it. "Veronica Hale has been operating in this valley for 20 years. She's sharp, she's patient, and she doesn't threaten people unless she's already decided they're a problem." "Then I'm a problem," Evelyn said. "You've been here 6 weeks. I've been encouraging Ruth Peters and some of the other wives to compare notes on their supply contracts." She said it straightforwardly because there was no point in being indirect. "And I suggested to Gil Hutchins that if the smaller ranches were buying feed together rather than separately, they might get a better price than going to the Hale Depot individually." Colton was quiet for a moment. "Gil told me." "I know he told you. I asked him to. He looked at her then, really looked, with the attention he usually kept behind glass. Why? Because I thought you should know what I was doing. You're not a man who likes surprises in his own household, and this is, in a broader sense, your household. She paused. And because what I'm suggesting isn't going to work unless it has the backing of the biggest operation in the valley, and that's you. The quiet this time was longer. He turned a pen over in his hand twice, which she'd noticed he did when he was thinking something through. You want me to anchor a purchasing cooperative to start. Eventually, I think it could be broader. Shared labor during branding and harvest, collective negotiation on cattle prices, maybe a community grain store. But that's further out. She leaned forward slightly. Right now, there are 6 families in this valley who are paying Hale prices because they have no alternative. If they have an alternative, if they can buy feed and supplies together through the Hayes operation at the prices your volume gets you, they become less dependent, less vulnerable.
Yeah, so Mike, almost trying.
And Veronica Hale loses income and leverage. Yes, he set the pen down. She will not take that quietly. I know. She has lawyers, she has contacts in the territorial government, she has buyers who've agreed not to purchase from ranches that break their contracts with her. He said it not as objection, but as information, laying out the landscape. She's been building this network for 2 decades. She's not going to watch it come apart without a fight.
I know that too, Evelyn said.
But the families who are trapped in that network are already fighting. They're just fighting alone, one at a time, and losing. The only difference I'm proposing is that they stop losing alone. Colton looked at her across his desk. The lamp between them caught the gray at his temples and the lines around his eyes that hadn't been made by weather alone. He was a man who had been somewhere else for 2.5 years and was slowly finding his way back, and she could see in his face that he was understanding, perhaps for the first time clearly, how much had happened in his own valley while he was lost in his own grief. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. She stood. The Peters family has a cracked axle on their supply wagon and no money to fix it until fall. Their 2 boys have been doing the run to Millhaven on horseback, which takes twice as long. If you had a spare axle pin in your equipment shed, that would be a place to start. She left him with that. What? The axle pin appeared at the Peters farm 2 days later, delivered by Nate Hayes on horseback, along with a note in Colton's handwriting that said simply, "Use it as long as you need it." Ruth Peters came to the Hayes kitchen the following Monday with a jar of preserved peaches and stayed for an hour and a half. And in that hour and a half, Evelyn learned more about the specific mechanics of Veronica Hale's operation than she'd gathered in the preceding 6 weeks. The supply contracts with penalty clauses for early termination. The loans extended in bad years at reasonable rates that became unreasonable when the terms reset. The way Hale had bought the only grain storage facility in the valley 8 years ago and had since set the storage rates wherever she chose. The cattle buyer network, which was the most effective lock of all. If Hale's buyers refused your animals, you had to ship them to Fort Graves, and the cost of that trip reduced your margin to almost nothing. It was, as Evelyn had understood but now saw more completely, a system designed with precision. Each piece reinforced the others. Remove one, and the others held. Remove enough of them simultaneously, and the whole thing began to lose its grip. Has anyone tried going to the territorial authorities? Evelyn asked. Ruth Peters looked at her with the particular patience of someone explaining something they've explained before to someone who hasn't lived it. The Territorial Land Commissioner came through 4 years ago, spent 3 days in Millhaven, left with a letter of commendation from the Hale Valley Commerce Association, which is Veronica's organization. She founded it, and a case of Hale's imported whiskey. She set her coffee down. The justice of the peace is a man named Corby who has a Hale mortgage on his house. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. There must be records of all of this. The contracts, the loans, the rate changes. Of course there are records. She keeps excellent records. That's part of the point. It's all legal, on paper. Legal enough that you'd need a lawyer from outside the valley and a judge who isn't obligated to her to make anything of it. Ruth looked at her steadily. And before you suggest it, nobody in this valley has money for an outside lawyer. The reason we can't afford lawyers is the same reason we need one. It was a clean trap. Evelyn could appreciate the architecture of it, even as she understood that appreciation was a cold comfort to the people living inside it. She thought about journalists, She thought about the land title records that had to be filed at the county seat in Harlan. She thought about the fact that Ruth Peters had just told her about several instances of mid-contract term changes that were not legal, regardless of what the justice of the peace chose to do with them. She thought about the fact that Colton Hayes was the only person in the Clearwater Valley who had the resources, the standing, and, crucially, no outstanding obligation to Veronica Hale. Oh, it took 2 more weeks, and it was not a single conversation but a dozen smaller ones. And in the end, it was not Evelyn who moved Colton, but his own children. It happened at dinner on a Thursday evening when Thomas came to the table with a specific energy, wound up, jaw set, the way he'd been in the early weeks before he'd found his footing. Evelyn noticed it, but let it sit through the first course. Then Thomas looked at his father and said, "The Mercer boys aren't going to school anymore." Colton looked at him. "Why not?" "Because their father is doing the supply run himself, now that Mr. Peters lent their horse to Mr. Henderson for the season, and the boys have to run the farm while he's gone." He said it in a rush, the way someone delivers information they've been carrying. "They've been out of school 3 weeks. Jake Mercer said they might not go back." Colton was quiet. "Jake's 11, Thomas said. "Same as Nate." Nate, across the table, was looking at his plate. Clara said, very quietly, "That's not fair." "No," Colton said. "It's not." He looked at his food. Then he looked up at Evelyn, across the table. A direct look, not the partial, careful looks he'd been giving her for weeks, but a full one, like someone deciding to stop looking away from a thing. "The cooperative," he said. Evelyn met his eyes. "Yes. I want to talk to Gil about the feed buying first. Then I want to see what it would take to deal with the grain storage situation." He set his fork down. "Can you put together the families who'd want to be part of it? A meeting here in the next 2 weeks?" "Yes," she said. Thomas was looking at his father with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but was something between them, softer than either. He looked like a boy who had just remembered that his father was, underneath everything, still his father. "Will it help the Mercers?" Thomas asked. "It might," Colton said. He looked at his son. "We'll try." Yeah. The meeting happened on a Saturday, 16 days later. 14 families came. They came in wagons and on horseback, some of them having driven most of a day to get there, and they filled the Hayes parlor and the front corridor and spilled out onto the porch, and Evelyn made coffee and kept the younger children out of the way, and listened from the kitchen while Colton Hayes stood in his own parlor and said, for the first time in 2.5 years, something that was not about cattle or ledgers, but about his neighbors. She could hear him through the wall, his voice carrying the way voices carry when they've been quiet a long time, and then have something to say. He laid out the proposal plainly. Collective purchasing, shared equipment, a joint negotiation on grain storage using the Hayes operation as leverage. He did not make it about Veronica Hale, not directly. He made it about what the valley could do for itself. It was the right framing, she thought, taking the emphasis off opposition and putting it on possibility. There were questions and objections, and she could hear the worry in some of the voices, the specific anxiety of people who had something small and precious, and were afraid of what happened if they betted on a cooperative arrangement and lost. A man named Flannery asked 3 times what would happen to his supply contract if Hale retaliated. A woman named Torres wanted to know what legal protection they had. Colton answered the question steadily. He did not promise what he couldn't guarantee. He said, "I don't know exactly what she'll do, but I know that what you're doing now isn't working, and I know that I'll stand beside anyone in this valley who decides to try." It was not a rousing speech. There was no particular eloquence to it, but it was honest, and it was specific, and it came from a man who had enough to lose that his presence at the front of the room meant something. 9 families signed on that day. 5 more sent word within the week. Evelyn, standing in the kitchen doorway, looked at the full parlor and thought, There is where things begin to change. She did not let herself think it was settled. She had heard enough about Veronica Hale to know that the response to this meeting would not be long in coming, and it would not be gentle. The woman on the boardwalk in Millhaven had not been making idle conversation, but she also thought of Thomas's face when his father said, "We'll try." And she thought of Rose asleep upstairs without crying, and she thought of Harriet, who had set down the ledger and picked up her schoolbook, and she thought,
As a lamp in the parlor threw its light out across the porch, where ranchers stood talking with the first real animation she'd heard from them since arriving in the valley, that some things, once begun, were harder to stop than the people who wanted to stop them understood. The valley was stirring. After a long and frozen season, something was coming back to life in it. Whether that something would survive what came next was another question entirely. Veronica Hale's first move was not what Evelyn expected. She had expected something direct, a legal challenge perhaps, or pressure on the families who had signed the cooperative agreement, the kind of economic lever-pulling that Hale had been practicing for 20 years. She had prepared herself for that kind of fight. What came instead was quieter and, in some ways, more effective than an open attack. It started with a story. She heard it first from Clara, of all people, who came home from school one afternoon in the second week after the cooperative meeting with a particular expression. The careful, contained look she got when she was carrying something that bothered her and was deciding whether to put it down. "Some of the girls at school said you used to work at a boarding house in Harlan," Clara said, finding Evelyn in the kitchen. Evelyn set down the pot she was holding. "I did. They said it wasn't a nice boarding house." Evelyn looked at her. Clara was 8 years old, and she was smart enough to understand more than 8-year-olds were supposed to understand. And she was looking at Evelyn now with the creek green eyes and the careful face, waiting. "It was a perfectly respectable boarding house," Evelyn said, "run by a widow named Mrs. Alcott, who was strict about her rules and her standards. I kept the accounts and managed the rooms for 2 years. She paused. "Who told the girls that story?" "Carla Hale," Clara said. "She's in my class." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Carla Hale. Veronica's niece, she recalled, a detail Ruth Peters had mentioned in passing. 10 years old, enrolled in Millhaven School, and apparently already learning the family trade. "What exactly did she say?" Evelyn asked. "That you weren't a real housekeeper, that you worked somewhere you shouldn't have, and that's why you left Harlan." Clara's voice was even, but her hands were doing a thing they did when she was agitated, pulling at the cuff of her sleeve. "I said she was wrong. She said I didn't know because you'd tricked us." "And what did you say to that?" "I said I'd eat my boot before I believed Carla Hale over my own eyes." She paused. "Then the teacher made us stop." Evelyn almost smiled. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Clara steadily. "The story isn't true. I can show you Mrs. Alcott's reference letter if you'd like to read it. It's in my room." "I don't need to read it," Clara said with a certainty that was both touching and a little sobering. "I already said she was wrong. I know. But I want you to understand, people are going to say things about this household in the coming weeks, some of them about your father, some of them about me, and some of them won't be true. And I want you to know that you can always ask me directly. I'll tell you what's real." Clara nodded once, gravely. Then she picked up her schoolbook and went to the table and started her lesson, which was her way of saying the conversation was complete. But the story spread, as these things do, and by the following week Evelyn could feel it in the way certain women in Millhaven looked at her when she came for supplies. Not hostility, exactly, but a new assessment, a recalibration of how they'd been reading her. It was the kind of social erosion that worked slowly and was difficult to counter directly, because the tool of choice was implication rather than accusation. Nobody said anything specific enough to refute. She told Colton about it. He was in the barn, a place he'd begun spending time in again, which she counted as a sign of life returning, checking on a heifer that was close to calving, and she came in out of the afternoon light and stood beside him at the stall while he ran a hand along the animal's side. "I've heard it," he said, before she'd finished laying it out. "You have. Patterson at the feed store mentioned it to Gil last week, said he'd heard you had a past that didn't bear looking at." He glanced at her sidelong. "I told Gil to tell Patterson that I'd be buying feed elsewhere if he had opinions about my household employees." She looked at him. "You did that before I came to you about it." "I have ears, Miss Carter." He moved to the other side of the stall. "She's done this before. A family named White Oak tried to organize a water rights petition 8 years back. Within a month there were stories about the White Oak boy. Drinking, gambling, debts. None of it was ever proven. But the petition fell apart." He paused. "She doesn't need the story to be believed. She just needs it to be in circulation. Creates doubt. Slows things down. Makes people nervous about association." "It won't work," Evelyn said.
Not with the families already in the cooperative, no. But there are 3 more who are considering it. This will make them hesitate. She stood with that for a moment. Then we need to move faster than the hesitation. He looked at her across the stall. Something in his face, not amusement, not quite, but the ghost of it. You say that like it's simple. I say it because it's the only option that doesn't involve sitting still and waiting to be picked apart. She kept her voice level. I'd like to meet with the 3 undecided families this week, before the story gets any louder. He considered. Then he nodded. I'll come with you. She hadn't expected that. She kept the surprise off her face. All right. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll ask Gil to ready the good wagon. She went back to the house, and that evening, setting the table for dinner, she thought about what it meant that he had already gone to the feed store on her behalf before she'd asked, before she'd even known he'd heard. She thought about the particular way a person moves when they're starting to let something matter to them again, carefully, watchfully, not trusting it yet, but not denying it either. She thought about what Veronica Hale was trying to undo, and how its undoing was more visible to her than to almost anyone, precisely because she'd arrived to find it in ruins. They visited the first undecided family on Tuesday and the second and third on Wednesday, and Colton did not make speeches at any of them. He sat in their parlors and at their kitchen tables, and he listened to their worries, which were specific and legitimate. The Garcias had a Hale lease renewal coming in August, and were afraid of retaliation on its terms. The Flannery family's grain contract had a clause they'd just reread that seemed to prohibit joining any competing purchasing arrangement. The widow Elspeth Randall ran a small cattle operation alone and was simply afraid, having no backup if things went wrong. He addressed each concern on its own terms. He found a lawyer, not from Fort Graves, but from a town further east, a man named Aldridge he'd done business with years ago, to look at the Flannery contract clause, which Aldridge confirmed by letter was unenforceable. He told the Garcias he would cover the first year of their lease payment if Hale retaliated on the renewal, which was the kind of offer that could only come from someone with enough to back it. He told Elspeth Randall that the cooperative's shared labor arrangements meant she would have help during branding and harvest, which was specifically what she'd been managing alone since her husband died. Elspeth, who was 61 and had the dried, wire-tough look of someone who had survived a long time on pure stubbornness, looked at Colton Hayes across her kitchen table and said, "Your wife would have liked this arrangement." Colton went still. It was the first time, to Evelyn's knowledge, that anyone had mentioned Catherine Hayes directly in his presence, and she watched him absorb it, the slight tension, the way his hands flattened on the tabletop. Then he said quietly, "Yes, I think she would have." Elspeth nodded once, satisfied. "Then I'm in." All 3 families joined the cooperative, and the week after that 2 more came forward without being asked, having heard through the web of Valley communication that the arrangement was real and that Hayes was behind it. The cooperative had 18 families now. It was not yet powerful enough to fully break Hale's grip on the Valley, but it was large enough that her grip had noticeably loosened on more than a dozen properties. Evelyn knew that the second move was coming. She just didn't know what shape it would take. It took the shape of Marcus Dray. He arrived at the beginning of summer, a man in a territorial inspector's coat who rode into Millhaven on a Tuesday and spent 2 days making inquiries about the Hayes operation. He was, he told people, conducting a routine investigation into land use and grazing rights in the Clearwater Valley. He was thorough and professional and entirely civil, and within 48 hours he had interviewed 6 people and filed a formal notice of investigation into potential overgrazing violations on the Hayes North pasture. Gil Hutchins brought the notice to Evelyn on a Thursday morning because he'd gotten to the mail at the gate first and Colton was out on the range. She read it. It was 6 pages, precise and official looking, citing 3 specific pasture sections and alleging that Hayes cattle had exceeded legal grazing density for 2 consecutive seasons. "Is any of it accurate?" she asked Gil. "No." He said it flat and certain. "We rotate those pastures on a strict schedule. Have done for 12 years. The north section's actually been underused this year. We've had the cattle on the south side because of a fencing repair." He shook his head. "Somebody gave him bad information or made it up wholesale." "Who's the inspector?" "Marcus Dray, out of the Territorial Land Office." He paused. "I've asked around. Nobody in the valley has had a visit from the land office in 4 years." She folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket. When does Colton get back? Late afternoon. Don't say anything to the children about it. She spent the afternoon thinking. An overgrazing investigation was not, in itself, catastrophic. Hayes had the records to defend the claims, which would take time but would ultimately resolve in their favor. What it was, she understood, was a message and a distraction. An investigation meant legal fees and time spent on documentation and attention pulled away from the cooperative, and it signaled clearly that Hale had contacts in the territorial office willing to do her favors. Colton came back at dusk, dust-coated and tired, and she met him at the barn door with the notice. He read it on horseback, which was not technically possible, but was approximately what happened. He barely made it down from the saddle before he'd gotten through the first page, and by the second his jaw was set. "This is fabricated," he said. "I know. We have records for every pasture rotation for the last 15 years. I know. Give them to Aldridge." She leaned against the barn door. "But before you do that, is there anything in your land title records, anything in your original grants or your water rights filings that could be used against you? Anything that isn't absolutely clean?" He looked at her sharply. "What kind of question is that? The kind you need to answer before Dre comes back with a second notice." She held his look. "I'm not suggesting you've done anything wrong. I'm suggesting that 20 years of documents have edges and ambiguities that a motivated investigator can use, and I want to know if there are any before he finds them." He was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. "There's a water rights claim on the Eastern Creek filed in 1871. It was disputed at the time by the previous owner of the Tolliver property. The dispute was resolved in my favor, but the paperwork, the resolution document, I'm not certain it was filed correctly at the county seat. It should have been. But in that period—" He stopped. "In that period you weren't paying close attention," she said, not as accusation. "No." He said it without flinching from it. "I wasn't. Get Aldridge to verify the filing as soon as possible. If it wasn't done right, fix it before anyone looks." She paused. "And while you're doing that, I want to talk to you about the journalist." He blinked. "What journalist?" "I've been writing letters," she said, "to 3 newspapers. One in Harlan, one in the capital, one regional paper that covers the territories. I laid out the situation in the valley, the loan manipulation, the supply contract terms, the lease structures. I didn't name anyone yet. I wanted to know if any of them were interested before I did." She looked at him steadily. "The regional paper sent a reply last week. A man named Foster who covers territorial affairs. He wants to come out and see it." Colton stared at her. "You did this without telling me. I was going to tell you when I had something definite to tell." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you now. Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss, and they both noticed it, and he pressed forward without acknowledging it. "If you bring a journalist into this valley while we already have a territorial inspector—" "The territorial inspector is Hale's instrument, and we both know it. The journalist is an independent one." She pushed off the barn door and looked at him directly. "Colton, she has the law in her pocket. We can fight that with lawyers and records, and we should, and we will. But the law's pocket is not the only place this can be won. Public attention is something she cannot buy. And if people outside this valley understand what she's been doing, it will make things worse here before it makes them better." "Yes," she said. "Probably." He looked at her, tired, dusty, carrying the investigation notice in one hand and the weight of a decision that had consequences he couldn't fully map. "You could have told me about the letters," he said. "I should have. I'm sorry." Another pause. He folded the notice and put it in his vest pocket. "Right back to Foster. Tell him to come. Chop." The barn fire happened 4 weeks later on a moonless Wednesday night in the deep middle of summer. Evelyn woke at 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, not kitchen smoke, but the thick mineral-edged smell of a large structure burning. She was out of bed and in the corridor before she was fully awake, and she could already hear the sound of it through the walls. A low roar that was building, the way a building fire builds, feeding itself. She got the children up first. That was the first thing before anything else. She went room by room, starting with Rose, who she picked up and carried, and then the others, calling their names and keeping her voice level so that they moved quickly without dissolving into panic. Thomas and Nate she sent immediately to help Gil, who she could already hear shouting in the yard. Harriet she gave Rose to and told her to take the younger ones to the front porch and keep them there. Clara came with Evelyn of her own insistence, which Evelyn didn't have time to argue. Louisa was already in the hallway when Evelyn reached her door. She'd been woken by the smell too, standing in her doorway with her dark eyes wide and her hair loose around her shoulders. "Barn?" she said. "Barn," Evelyn confirmed. "Get your coat and go to the front porch with Harriet." Louisa's jaw set. "I can help." "I know. Go to Harriet." She didn't wait to see if Louisa obeyed. She went for the back door, Clara right behind her, and came out into a night that was orange and wrong. The barn was fully involved. The whole east side was a wall of fire, 20 feet high or more, and the light of it was so absolute that the yard looked like midday in the dark, every blade of dry grass casting a shadow. She could hear the cattle. Some of them had gotten out, and they were running in the pasture, their silhouettes dark against the fire's edge, and some of them had not gotten out, and she could hear that too, and she shut that sound into a part of her mind and left it there. Gil had the hands on the water pump and the well chain, two men she didn't recognize alongside Nate and Thomas who were passing buckets in a line, but it was already clear that they were fighting to keep it from spreading to the outbuildings rather than to save the barn itself. The barn was gone. She looked for Colton. He was at the fence line between the barn and the nearest equipment shed, soaking grain sacks in the trough and laying them along the base of the shed wall. She went to him. "The cattle," she started. 30 head still inside when it went up, he said. He was not looking at her. He was soaking sacks and laying them with the focused, mechanical movement of someone who had replaced feeling with function because feeling was not useful right now. "We got the others out. 42 made it." She did the arithmetic. 30 head of cattle. She had a general sense of what 30 head represented in dollars and in practical loss, and it was significant. How did it start? He paused just for a second. The hands found the west door latched from the outside. That door is always latched from inside at night. She let that sit. From the outside. Which meant someone had come to the barn, in the dark, and she didn't finish the thought. Not yet. "Is anyone hurt?" "No." Jed Burns got his hand on a hot latch. Nothing serious. He laid another sack. "The kids?" "On the front porch. They're all right." He stopped then, with a wet grain sack in his hands, and looked up for the first time, not at her, but at the barn. The roof was going. The timber beams at the peak were burning through, and as she watched, a section collapsed inward with a sound like a low, close thunderclap, and a column of sparks rose straight up into the black sky. His face in the firelight was difficult to read, and she did not try. "Go back to the house," he said. "Stay with the children." "Colton, please," he said. She went. The morning after a barn fire had a particular quality she had not experienced before and hoped not to experience again. The smell was everywhere, in her hair, in the curtains, in the flour when she opened the canister. The yard was gray with ash. The site of the barn was a collapsed, smoking ruin of beams and burned stone, still too hot to approach, and over it a thin haze moved in the morning air. The children were quiet at breakfast. Thomas ate nothing. Rose kept looking out the window and then away, the way you look at something that frightens you, but that you can't stop looking at. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, which was the position she defaulted to when she was controlling something. Colton came to breakfast for the first time in the morning. He had not slept. She could see it in the precise way exhaustion sat on a person, the specific flatness around the eyes. And he sat down and poured coffee and looked at his children. "The animals that made it out are safe in the south pasture," he said. "The building itself can be rebuilt. It'll take time and money and work, but it can be done." He was talking to Thomas, she understood, Thomas specifically, because Thomas was the one who needed to hear it said plainly by the person who had the most reason to be undone by it. "We're not finished. Not." Thomas looked at his father. Something moved in his face. The complexity of a 13-year-old who was still learning which emotions went with which events. "Do you know who did it?" Colton looked at him steadily. "I have a good idea." "What are you going to do?" "Everything I should have done a long time ago," Colton said. He drank his coffee. And across the table, Evelyn wrapped her hands around her own cup and understood that something had shifted in the night, something that the fire had, in its terrible way, clarified. The grief that had been keeping Colton Hayes behind glass had not disappeared, but it had been pushed aside by something more immediate, and what had come up through its place looked, to her, a great deal like anger. The useful kind. The kind that moves. Martin Foster arrived in Millhaven 3 days after the fire, on a Thursday afternoon, and Evelyn met him at the post road where she'd told him to wait. He was younger than she'd imagined from his letters. Mid-30s, slight, with the watchful eyes of a man whose job was to see things other people had decided not to look at. He had a satchel and a notebook, and he smelled of train travel, and he shook her hand with a directness that she appreciated. "You're the housekeeper?" he said. "I am." He looked at the valley, the wide, good land of it, the grass running to the hills, the creek line shining to the east. "I got your letters," he said. "I've done some preliminary checking. Some of the loan records you referenced are in public filings. The interest recalculations are—" He paused, looking for the right word. "They're very interesting." "There's more," she said. "Much more. And 3 days ago, someone burned down the main barn on the Hayes Ranch. 30 cattle dead. The door was latched from outside." Foster looked at her. He opened his notebook. "I need to speak with the affected families," he said. "All of them, if they'll speak to me." "They'll speak to you," Evelyn said. "Come to the ranch first. Mr. Hayes wants to meet you." The meeting between Colton Hayes and Martin Foster happened in the study that evening. Evelyn was present. She'd asked to be, and Colton had not objected. Foster was careful and professional, asking questions in a sequence that told her he had done real preparation, and Colton answered them with the particular authority of a man who knew his own ground. When Foster asked about the fire, Colton was precise. The latched door, the timing, the pattern of how the fire had spread, the absence of any other plausible cause. "Do you have documentation of the Hale operations practices?" Foster asked. "Copies of contracts, records of the rate changes, loan documents?" "Some of them," Colton said. "The families in the cooperative have more. And I have a lawyer in the process of pulling the original land records from the county seat. If those turn up what I think they will, what do you think they'll turn up?" Colton was quiet for a moment. "I think we'll find that several of the lease agreements Veronica Hale has been collecting were sold to her under conditions that don't survive legal scrutiny. I think we'll find that the recorded terms in the county seat don't match the terms the families were actually given." He looked at Foster. "I think the paper trail is inconsistent, and that an inconsistent paper trail, when examined by the right eyes, is its own kind of evidence." Foster wrote in his notebook. "That's fraud." "If it proves out, yes." Colton leaned forward in his chair. "But what I need you to understand, Mr. Foster, is that for 15 years, no one with the ability to do anything about it has chosen to look. That is also something worth writing about." Foster looked at him. Then he wrote something else in the notebook, and whatever he wrote, he underlined it. When Foster left for the evening to take a room in Millhaven, Evelyn walked him to the post road, and he stopped at the edge of the Hayes gate and looked back at the house. Lit from within, the kitchen lamp and the parlor lamp making warm shapes in the dusk. "She didn't expect this," he said, meaning Hale. "The fire was supposed to demoralize, but instead it made things clearer," Evelyn said. "For Hayes, certainly. I've interviewed a lot of people who've had something taken from them. That man in there is not going to stop." She thought about Colton's face at the breakfast table, the morning after, telling Thomas we're not finished. "No," she said. "He's not." Foster looked at her. "What about you? You came here as a housekeeper." "I am a housekeeper." "Right." He said it dryly, with a small recognition she didn't deflect. "You should know, Miss Carter, when I publish, and I will publish, she will know that someone helped organize this. She'll know who that person is." She met his eyes in the last of the evening light. "I know that," she said. "You're not concerned?" She thought about 7 children in that house. She thought about Rose asleep without crying. She thought about Harriet, who had put down the ledger, and Thomas, who had picked up the axe, and Louisa, who had come to dinner and sat at the end of the table and was, slowly and on her own terms, finding her way back to being part of a family. She thought about 18 families who had signed on to something that asked them to be braver than the valley had been letting them be. "I'm concerned about a lot of things," she said. "That's not one of them." Foster nodded. He walked toward Millhaven. Behind her, the house sat in the cooling evening, full of light and the sound of children and the smell of wood smoke and supper. And beyond it, the ruined site of the barn was dark and cold now, the fire long spent. Things had been set in motion that could not be recalled. Martin Foster's article ran in the regional paper on a Friday morning, and by Saturday afternoon 3 copies of it had made their way into the Clearwater Valley through Travelers and the Post Road, and by Sunday the valley was talking about nothing else. Evelyn read it at this kitchen table before the children were up, in the gray early light with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Foster had written it carefully, not sensationally, not with the overwrought language of someone trying to make a name for himself, but with the patient, documented precision of someone who understood that the most damaging thing he could do to Veronica Hale was simply to describe what she had done in plain terms, and let the plainness speak. He named the loan structures and explained how the interest recalculations worked. He described the supply contract penalty clauses and the grain storage monopoly. He quoted 3 families by name, the Garcias, the Peters, and Elspeth Randall, all of whom had agreed to be named. And he quoted Colton Hayes at length, which gave the piece a credibility that a collection of small ranchers alone would not have provided. He mentioned the barn fire. He noted that the west door had been latched from outside. He did not directly accuse anyone, but the structure of the article made the implication clear enough that it didn't need to be stated. He had not named Evelyn at all, which she had not asked for and which she suspected was his own professional judgment rather than an oversight. She was present in the article as a kind of negative space. The cooperative had been organized, the families had been connected, the lawyer had been engaged, the letters had been written, but the article did not attribute these actions to any individual. It was the kind of careful omission that journalists sometimes made, and she was grateful for it, though she understood it would not protect her from anyone who was paying close enough attention. She set the paper down and looked out the kitchen window at the morning. The response came faster than she had anticipated. On Monday, the territorial inspector Marcus Dre returned to Mill Haven. This time, he did not limit himself to the Hayes Ranch. He filed notices of investigation against 4 cooperative member families simultaneously, citing a range of violations that spanned livestock management, fence line disputes, and water usage. The notices were varied enough that they looked on the surface like routine regulatory activity. They were not routine. The Garcia family's notice cited a water usage claim on a creek section that Evelyn knew for a fact had been specifically excluded from Hale's water rights in the original county seat filings from 1869. She knew this because Aldridge, the lawyer, had by then completed his review of the land records, and he had sent Colton a letter that arrived the same Monday as Dre's second wave of notices. And the letter was 11 pages long and contained findings that, when Colton read them at the study desk with Evelyn standing across from him, caused him to sit back in his chair and press both hands flat on the desk. "Read the 3rd section," he said, handing her the letter. She read it. The 3rd section documented a pattern of discrepancies between the lease agreements held by affected families, the copies they had signed, and the corresponding records filed at the county seat in Harlan. In 6 cases, the terms as filed differed materially from the terms as held by the families. Interest rates, repayment structures, penalty provisions. In each case, the discrepancy favored the party collecting on the lease, which was a holding company registered to a legal address in the capital that Aldridge had traced, through 3 intermediary structures, back to Veronica Hale's commercial operation. She looked up from the letter. "This is fraud," she said. "Documented, systemic fraud. Over a period of at least 12 years, Colton said. He looked steadier than she expected. The kind of steadiness that comes not from calm, but from having found the thing you were looking for and knowing now exactly what you have to do with it. Aldridge says he can file a formal complaint with the Territorial Attorney General's office. He says the documentation is strong enough that a competent prosecutor would have to take it seriously. How long does that process take? Months, maybe longer. He looked at her. In the meantime, she'll keep pressing. The Dre notices. Those are going to cost the families time and legal fees and anxiety they don't have to spare. That's the point of them. I know. She put the letter back on the desk. I want to call another meeting, all 18 families. I want them to see the Aldridge letter. That exposes the evidence before we filed. It also tells them that there is evidence, that what they've been living through is documented now. that someone with standing and expertise has looked at it and said, "This happened." She paused. These families have been made to feel that they were imagining things, or that their memory of what they signed was wrong, or that they simply didn't understand the terms correctly. Aldridge's letter says, "No, you understood correctly. What was done to you was real." Colton was quiet for a long moment, then, "Set the meeting." The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the Hayes barn lot. There was no barn anymore to hold it in, just the cleared foundation and the smell of old char. But Gil had put up lanterns on posts, and the families came in the warm summer dark and stood in the light of them. 19 families this time. The 20th had sent a message that they were willing to join but could not travel that night due to a sick child. Colton stood at the front of the group with the Aldridge letter, and he read the relevant sections aloud, plainly, without editorial. He let the numbers and the discrepancies speak in their own voice. Around him, the families listened, and as the reading went on, the quality of the silence changed. It became denser, more particular, the silence of people absorbing something that is both shocking and completely, precisely what they'd always known. When he finished, a man named Vicente Garcia said, "She filed different papers than what we signed." "Yes," Colton said. That's a crime." "According to our lawyer, yes, a significant one." A woman near the back, Evelyn didn't recognize her, a new face from one of the recently joined families, said, "What's stopping her from filing more notices? From Dre or somebody like him coming for all of us?" "Nothing right now," Colton said. "That's honest. We're not in a position yet where she can't reach us, but we're in a position where what she's done is documented and where the people who need to know about it are beginning to know." He looked around the group. The Territorial Attorney General's office is going to receive a formal complaint by the end of this week. Martin Foster's article has already been reprinted in 2 other papers. There's a lawyer in the Capitol who contacted Aldridge 3 days ago because he'd read the article and recognized the pattern from similar cases he's worked in other territories. He paused. "She's been doing this for 20 years because nobody with the resources to push back has pushed back. That's changing." The woman near the back said, "But until it changes all the way, we're exposed." "Yes," Colton said again. "I won't lie to you about that." The woman looked at him. Then she nodded, not easily, not without cost, but with the resignation of someone who has decided that the honest risk is preferable to the dishonest safety. "All right," she said, "then we keep going. Most of them said the same thing, in different words, in different voices, over the next 2 hours. Not all of them were steady about it. The Flannery family looked frightened the whole time, and the old man Hendricks, who ran sheep on the valley's north edge, came close to saying he was pulling out, before Ruth Peters, who was standing next to him, said something quietly that Evelyn didn't hear, and he stayed. After the families left, Colton and Evelyn stood in the cooling night in the cleared foundation of the burned barn. The lanterns were still up, and their light moved in a slight wind. "You spoke well," she said. He looked sideways at her. "I just told them the truth. That's what speaking well is, most of the time." He was quiet for a moment. "When Catherine died," he stopped, started again, differently. "There was a period when I convinced myself that holding still was the same as holding things together, that if I didn't move, nothing else could break." He looked at the dark foundation. "I was wrong about that. Things kept breaking regardless. I was just not there to see it." She didn't say anything. She'd learned when to let something that was being offered stay in the air without rushing to meet it. "The valley was coming apart while I was looking at the floor of my own study," he said. "My children were holding their breath. Harriet was running a household at 12 years old, Louisa." He stopped at Louisa's name. "I don't know how much I missed. I don't think I want to count it all at once." "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "You just have to be here now." He turned to look at her then. Really look. In the unguarded way he'd been doing more of lately, though she suspected he wasn't fully aware of it. "You came here for a housekeeping job," he said. "I did." "And you stayed for—" He didn't finish the sentence as a question. It sat there as a statement with an open end. She considered how to answer it honestly. "I stayed because it needed doing," she said. "The household, the children, and because once I saw what was happening in the valley,
She paused. I'm not a person who can look at something wrong and decide it's not my business. No, he said. I don't imagine you are. The wind moved the lanterns and their shadows shifted across the charred ground. I should have asked you earlier, he said. Why you left Harlan? You told Clara it was the boarding house, Mrs. Alcott's reference. But that's where you were, not why you left. She had expected this question eventually, the way you expect a season to change. You know it's coming. You just don't know the exact day. She looked at the lantern nearest her. I was managing the accounts at Alcott's, and through that I was doing the accounts for 2 other businesses on the same street, a dry goods merchant and a small hotel. The hotel owner had been falsifying his tax filings for 3 years. I found it in the numbers. I told him privately that it needed to be corrected. She paused. He went to Alcott and told her I'd been making accusations to cover my own mishandling of the accounts. Mrs. Alcott, she was a fair woman, but she was also a practical one, and he was a paying customer and I was staff. She let me go. Colton was quiet. I filed a report with the county assessor before I left, she said. The hotel owner was eventually audited. I don't know what came of it because I'd already left for the next thing by then. She looked at him. I have a habit of not leaving things alone when they should be left alone. That's not a flaw, he said. Mrs. Alcott thought it was. Mrs. Alcott was wrong. She looked at him in the lantern light. He was standing a few feet from her, with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he'd decided to take seriously. Full, unhurried, present. Thank you, she said. It came out more simply than she'd intended, without the layer of practical deflection she usually kept in reserve, and she didn't retrieve it. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he said, I'll see to the lanterns. And they went back to the house. Veronica Hale's third move was also, Evelyn would come to think, her most desperate. And in its desperation, it revealed something about the architecture of her position that she could not have revealed any other way. It came through the justice of the peace, Corby, in the form of a formal complaint filed against the cooperative itself, alleging that the collective purchasing arrangement constituted an illegal restraint of trade under territorial commerce statutes. It was a creative argument, not entirely without legal basis, which was the most alarming thing about it, and it was filed on a Friday so that the families would spend the weekend without legal counsel, absorbing the anxiety of it. Colton received the notice on Friday afternoon and had Aldridge on a telegraph line by Friday evening. Aldridge's reply came Saturday morning. The restraint of trade argument was weak, but it would require a formal response, which meant a hearing, which meant appearing before the Valley's Justice of the Peace, who had a Hale mortgage on his house. She's trying to exhaust us, Evelyn said. She was in the study with Colton, the Saturday morning telegraph message in his hand. Each of these actions costs us time and money and energy to respond to. Individually, none of them is fatal. Together, they're designed to wear down the families who have the least to spare until they drop out of the cooperative. I know. He set the telegram down. The Flannery family got a message yesterday. Their grain storage contract was terminated by Hale with 30 days' notice. They've got a harvest coming in 8 weeks. She absorbed that. How much grain? Enough that 30 days isn't enough time to find alternative storage at a reasonable rate. He looked at her. There are 2 more families in a similar position. Hale's contracts allow her to terminate supply and storage arrangements for any reason with 30 days' notice. She's starting to use that provision. The cooperative has to be ready to absorb the storage need, Evelyn said immediately. We talked about a shared grain facility. How far out is that? 8 months at minimum. We don't have the facility built yet. We don't have the capital committed. What would it cost to lease temporary storage from someone outside the valley for 1 season? She was thinking out loud, moving through the pieces. Not a permanent solution, just enough to get the affected families through this harvest without having to go back to Hale. He was quiet for a moment. I'd have to make some calls. There's a feed and grain operation in Denton that I've dealt with before. They might have overflow capacity. Will you call them? He looked at her. Yes. She stood up. I'm going to go see the Flannerys this afternoon. They need to know this is being addressed before they lose a week to worrying about it. Take the good wagon, he said. The road to their place is rough after rain. He said it without looking up from the notes he was making. Practical, forward-facing, the voice of someone thinking about the problem rather than the fear of the problem.
and it struck her, as it had been striking her for weeks now, how completely and how quietly he had come back. Not back to what he'd been before. She didn't know what that was, had never met that version of him. But back to something. Back to a man who noticed when the road was rough, who called the lawyers and the telegraph lines and stood in front of his neighbors in the lantern light and told them the truth, who picked up his youngest daughter's fork from the floor and handed it back to her and said, "Be more careful." She picked up her coat from the hook. "Evelyn," she turned. He was still looking at the notes on the desk. "When this is finished," he said, "when the legal matter is resolved and the cooperative is stable and the valley is whatever it's going to be after all this." He stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I want to say that plainly before events make it complicated to say." She stood with her coat in her hands. "I'm saying it plainly now," he said, "because I spent 2.5 years not saying things that needed to be said, and I'm done with that practice." She thought about the woman who had arrived in a borrowed wagon 8 months ago with one good bag and a reference letter from a boarding house in Harlan, who had knocked on the front door and found a girl of 8 on the other side with careful eyes, who had opened the kitchen curtains and made scrambled eggs and sat at the end of a table full of children who were holding their breath. She thought about how she had told herself, one thing at a time, one thing, then the next. "I wasn't planning to leave," she said. He looked up then. "I haven't been planning to leave for a while now," she said. "I thought you might have noticed." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but something in the same general direction, something she had not seen there before. "I noticed," he said. "I wasn't sure I had the right to act on what I noticed." "You have the right," she said, and left him with that, and walked out to get the good wagon. The hearing before Justice Corby was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and in those 3 weeks the Valley went through a particular kind of compressed time where a great deal happened and each day felt like more than a day should be able to contain. The Capitol lawyer, his name was Edmund Reyes, 40 years old, with a reputation for territorial land fraud cases that Aldridge had confirmed through professional channels, arrived by stage and spent 4 days at the Hayes Ranch going through documents. He was methodical and largely silent, and he went through Aldridge's findings with a fine-toothed attention that Evelyn found reassuring. On his 3rd day, he told Colton that the formal complaint to the Attorney General's office would be strengthened considerably if any of the affected families still had the original copies of their lease agreements, the ones they had been given to sign, as opposed to the filed versions. "The discrepancies are documented in the filed records," Reyes said, "but if we can show a family with both copies what they signed and what was filed, that's a direct demonstration. A jury understands that." "It's been years," Colton said. "Most of them may not have kept them." "Most of them did," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. "Frontier families keep paper," she said. "They keep every document that was ever handed to them because out here, paper is the only proof you have of anything. I'd be surprised if more than 2 or 3 of the 18 families don't have their original copies." She looked at Reyes. "I'll ask." 14 families still had their original lease copies. Of those 14, 9 showed clear discrepancies from the county seat filings. Reyes spent 2 days photographing the documents. He'd brought a portable camera from the Capitol, which caused a minor sensation among the younger children, and sent the photographs by express mail to his office. "This is very good," he told Evelyn on his last evening, before he left for the Capitol. "Good enough?" she asked. "It's good enough that when I file this complaint, the Attorney General is going to have a significant problem if he doesn't act on it." He paused. "Whether he acts on it promptly is another question. There are political considerations. There always are. But the documentation removes his ability to simply decline without explanation. He'll have to account for inaction." He picked up his satchel. "Your journalist friend has been useful, by the way. The coverage has created a public record. It's harder to make something disappear when it's been reported in 4 papers." She walked him to the post road. The evening was warm, summer still holding, the last light going gold over the grass. "Miss Carter," Reyes said at the gate, "if the families had come to a lawyer a decade ago with what they had, they couldn't afford it," she said, "and the lawyers who were available were obligated to hail." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying, what you built here, the cooperative, the connections, the trust between the families, that's not a legal instrument. But without it, the legal instruments don't work. You can't bring a fraud case on behalf of 19 families who aren't talking to each other." He paused. What you did was necessary. A lot of people did it, she said. Someone had to start it. She watched him go and went back to the house. Justice Corby's hearing was, in the event, a disaster for Veronica Hale, though not because of anything that happened in the courtroom. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. On Wednesday afternoon, a notice arrived at the Hayes Ranch from the Territorial Attorney General's office in the capital, informing Colton Hayes that a formal investigation had been opened into the land records practices of a commercial holding entity registered to a capital address. The notice instructed him to preserve all documentation and to expect contact from an investigator. Edmund Reyes had moved faster than anyone had expected him to. The notice was also delivered, according to the postmaster in Mill Haven, to 6 other parties, including, Evelyn understood from the pattern of it, Veronica Hale herself. She heard about this from Gil Hutchins, who had it from the post road driver, and she was in the kitchen making bread when the information arrived, and she stood at the work table with her hands in the dough and breathed for a moment. The hearing before Corby proceeded the following morning. Aldridge appeared on behalf of the cooperative and made a competent argument against the restraint of trade claim. Corby, who had evidently received some information overnight that had recalibrated his position, delivered a ruling that was notably less confident and sweeping than his previous decisions in Hale-adjacent matters had been. He dismissed the claim without fully endorsing it on narrow procedural grounds, which was not a victory so much as a refusal to be a tool any further. After the hearing, in the dusty street outside the Justice Building in Mill Haven, Veronica Hale stood on the far side of the road and looked at Evelyn. It was the first time they had been in the same space since the boardwalk conversation months ago. Hale looked composed. She was, Evelyn thought, a woman who would look composed even in the worst circumstances, because composure had been her primary professional instrument for 30 years. But there was something different in her face today. She looked beneath the composure, like a person who has understood that the ground she is standing on is no longer the same ground she surveyed last season. She did not come across the street. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and Evelyn looked back, and neither of them said anything. Then Hale turned and walked to her waiting carriage and was driven away. Colton appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. He had been inside for the hearing and had come out behind her. "She looked at you," he said. "Yes." "What was that?" "I think that was her deciding what I am." She watched the carriage move down the main street of Mill Haven. "She thought I was temporary, something to manage and wait out." "And now?" "Now she knows better." She turned from the street. "It's not over. The Attorney General's investigation will take months, and she has lawyers, and she will use every day of those months to protect what she can protect. The families in the cooperative need to be prepared for that." "They are," Colton said. He said it with a certainty she recognized. It was the certainty of someone who had been paying attention, who knew the people he was talking about. "The Flannerys are scared," she said. "Everyone is scared. They're doing it anyway." She looked at him. "That's usually how it works," she said. They walked back toward the wagon. The main street of Mill Haven was carrying on its ordinary life around them. The feed store, the dry goods, the post office, the people who went about their day in the long summer heat. Colton walked beside her, and their shadows ran together on the dust of the road, and she thought about how much had happened since she'd sat on the bench outside the dry goods store and watched Veronica Hale cross the street toward her with her social smile and her careful warning. At the wagon, before she climbed up, she said, "Clara asked me this morning if I'd teach her to do accounts." Colton looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said yes." She looked at him. "She wants to understand the cooperative's books. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Somebody needs to know how the money works, and none of the boys are going to do it.'" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's right." "She's 8 years old, and she's already right," Evelyn said. Something crossed his face. Pride, she thought, and something alongside it that was newer and more complicated. The look of a man learning to take pleasure in his children again after forgetting how. "Let her learn," he said. She climbed up onto the wagon bench. He climbed up on the other side. The late morning heat pressed down on the valley, and ahead of them the road ran out through the good long grass toward the Hayes Ranch, toward the children and the kitchen and the summer still going and the work still ahead. The days that followed the hearing were not calm. They were never going to be calm, not with an active Attorney General's investigation and a woman like Veronica Hale still drawing breath in the Capitol, but they had a different quality to them. The families in the cooperative stopped flinching at every piece of mail. The new grain storage arrangement in Denton held through the first month, and the Flannery harvest came in and was stored without crisis. Thomas Hayes rebuilt the fence line on the north pasture by hand, with Nate beside him on the post hole auger. And when it was finished, he came to the kitchen door with dirty hands and said to Evelyn, with the offhand manner of a boy who does not want to be seen making a declaration, "Papa says we're going to start the barn frame next month."
"I heard that," she said. "He says maybe we'll make it bigger than the old one." "What do you think?" Thomas considered this with the gravity he gave to things that mattered. "Yeah," he said. "I think bigger." She handed him a biscuit, which he took without ceremony, and he went back out into the afternoon.
In the evenings, Louisa came to dinner without needing to be invited anymore. She sat beside her father now, rather than at the far end of the table, and she did not talk much, but she was present in a way she hadn't been. She passed dishes and answered questions and occasionally said something dry and unexpectedly accurate about the conversation happening around her that made Colton look at her with an expression that was, in its complicated way, the beginning of a father learning his daughter again after a long time apart. Evelyn watched this and held herself back from it, the way you hold a flame cupped against the wind, not trying to make it larger, just trying to keep it alive until it could sustain itself. One evening in late summer, she was at the east window of the kitchen, the window she had opened on her first morning and had kept open ever since, washing the last of the supper dishes, and she heard Colton step in the corridor and then the kitchen door. He came in and picked up a drying cloth from the rack without being asked and started on the stack of dried plates. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the plates. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He dried a plate. They worked in the comfortable quiet for a while. Outside the window, the summer evening was long and soft, the light stain laid on the grass, the sound of the children somewhere in the yard, Clara's voice and Thomas's, and underneath them the high, indistinct sound of Rose, who was no longer the small, tragic figure of Evelyn's first weeks, but a 3, almost 4-year-old who had developed opinions about which flowers were worth picking and which were not, and who communicated these opinions at length to anyone within range. "The Attorney General's investigator arrives next week," Colton said. "I know. Reyes says the preliminary findings are strong. I know that too." He dried another plate. "It's going to be a long process still, even with everything we've built." "Yes," she said. "You understand, when it's over, when she's been dealt with and the valley is settled, the cooperative is going to need management, someone who understands the accounts, someone the families trust." He paused. "I was thinking Aldridge could provide legal oversight, and Clara could—" "Clara is 8, she said. "She's learning fast." "She is," Evelyn agreed. "But in the meantime—" "In the meantime," he said. He set down a plate. "I was thinking you might be willing to take on that role. Formally. Not as part of your household work, as something separate." She turned to look at him fully. He was watching her with that direct, careful attention he'd developed over the months. Not the half-present gaze of the man she'd met in the corridor in her first weeks, but something fully inhabited. "That would be a significant change to my position here," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm aware of that." He held her look. "I'm also aware that I said I didn't want you to leave, and that you said you weren't planning to." He paused. "I'd like to talk about what that means. When there's time. When things are less—" "They're never going to be less," she said, not unkindly. "There's always going to be something. The investigation, then the cooperative, then the new barn, then Clara's arithmetic. There's never going to be a moment when everything is settled enough that it feels like the right time." He was quiet. "So we might as well talk now," she said. "Or not. But if we're waiting for a quiet moment, we'll wait a long time." He looked at her. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not a performed one, but a real one. The kind that comes when something catches a person by surprise and they don't have time to manage their reaction to it. It changed his face entirely, briefly, into something younger and less weathered. "All right," he said. "Now then." "Now," she agreed. Outside, Rose's voice rose and fell over the question of a flower. The evening light came through the east window, the one that had been closed when Evelyn arrived and had been open every morning since. The dishes were half done, and the kitchen smelled of supper and soap and the summer evening coming in, and they were two imperfect, complicated people, standing at a sink with a drying cloth and a long conversation ahead of them. And if it was not what either of them would have predicted for themselves a year ago, it was, for all that, exactly what it was: real, unpolished, and worth everything it had cost to get there. The Attorney General's investigator was a woman named Claire Sondergaard, which nobody in the Clearwater Valley had expected, and which Veronica Hale's lawyers apparently found destabilizing in ways they could not quite articulate in professional language. She arrived on the Tuesday stage from the Capitol with 2 assistants and a traveling case full of files, and she was 52 years old and had the unhurried, comprehensive attention of someone who had spent 3 decades looking at documents that people had tried very hard to make unreadable. Evelyn met her at the post road as she had met Foster, and Sondergaard shook her hand and looked at the valley with the same evaluating squint she probably applied to ledger pages. "Aldridge speaks highly of your organizational work," Sondergaard said as they walked to the wagon. "Aldridge is generous. Aldridge is precise. He doesn't use words generously." She climbed up onto the wagon bench without assistance. "I've reviewed the documentation he sent. I want to walk through the original lease copies with the families directly. I want to hear the loan histories in their own words." She looked at Evelyn. "The families, how are they holding?" "They're tired," Evelyn said honestly. "It's been a long year. Some of them were already tired before it started." "Will they talk to me?" "Yes. They've been waiting for someone official to ask." Sondergaard nodded once, satisfied. "Then let's not waste their time." She worked for 2 weeks, moving between farms and kitchen tables and the Hayes study, where the consolidated documentation lived in organized boxes that Evelyn had labeled and cross-referenced over the preceding month. She interviewed 19 families, and she interviewed Gil Hutchins, and she interviewed Martin Foster, who had come back from the Capitol at Evelyn's request, and she spent a full day with Edmund Reyes going through the Capitol N filings. On her last evening, she sat in the Hayes parlor with Colton and Evelyn, and she said, with the matter-of-fact plainness of a professional describing conditions she had observed, "What was done here is prosecutable, clearly, significantly, and on multiple counts. The document fraud alone, the discrepancies between signed agreements and filed records, represents 19 separate instances of deliberate misrepresentation, spanning 12 years, executed through a shell structure that was specifically designed to obscure the chain of responsibility." She paused. It was sophisticated work, patient. Someone with a great deal of intelligence applied it to a purpose that didn't deserve it. "Will she be prosecuted?" Colton asked. "I'm going to recommend prosecution. What the Attorney General does with that recommendation is his decision, but the documentation is clean enough that declining to act would be its own story." She glanced at Evelyn when she said that, a brief, deliberate glance, and Evelyn understood. Foster's coverage had not been an accident of timing. It had made inaction politically costly. "How long?" Evelyn asked. "For prosecution? A year, possibly more. These cases are slow." Sondergaard gathered her papers. "But the investigation itself has immediate effects. Several of Hale's commercial partners have already begun distancing themselves. I've seen the correspondence. The buyer network that was locking your ranchers out of outside markets has been quietly dissolving since Foster's first article ran. When the people who were benefiting from the arrangement understood that it was going to be examined, they chose not to be examined with it." After Sondergaard left, Colton and Evelyn sat in the parlor for a while without talking. The house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet in the late evening now. Not the held-breath silence of its earlier months, but the settled quiet of a place that had been inhabited fully. The children upstairs, and the lamps burning low, and the summer night outside the windows doing its gradual work of cooling toward fall. "It'll be a year," Evelyn said eventually. "Maybe more." "Yes. The families need to know it won't be quick." "I'll tell them." He was quiet for a moment. "They've held this long. They'll hold longer." She thought he was right. Something had changed in the cooperative over the course of the summer that went beyond the practical arrangements, the shared purchasing and the storage and the legal protection. The families had started to depend on each other in the way that neighbors are supposed to depend on each other, and rarely do, because dependence requires trust, and trust requires time, and most people don't have time to spare for trust building when they're fighting to survive alone. They'd had it forced on them, in a way,
The cooperative had made interdependence practical before it made it personal. But somewhere in the months of shared worry and shared work, it had become both. She had watched Ruth Peters and Elspeth Randall develop a friendship that had no apparent practical basis. Two women of different ages and temperaments who had found each other through the cooperative meetings and who now appeared, on the evidence, to be simply friends, the kind you visit on purpose. She had watched the Mercer boys go back to school, and Jake Mercer, Jake, who'd been 11 and had told Thomas he might not be going back, had been helping with the cooperative accounts on Saturdays, learning the same things Clara was learning. Two children from different families with different circumstances sitting at the same table working on the same numbers. These things weren't solved by the investigation. They'd been built while the investigation was still an idea in a letter she hadn't sent yet. They would remain after the investigation was concluded, whatever form that conclusion took. That, she understood, was the actual point. The investigation was the ceiling coming off. What had been built underneath it was the structure that would stand. Bummock. The news of Veronica Hale's indictment came in the following spring, 14 months after Sondergaard's visit. A formal charging document from the Territorial Attorney General's office listing 11 counts of document fraud, 3 counts of illegal business manipulation, and 2 counts relating to the misuse of public record filings. Edmund Reyes sent a telegraph to Colton the morning the indictment was issued, and Colton brought it to the breakfast table and read it to his children. Thomas said, "Is it over?" "Not yet," Colton said. "There'll be a trial. It could take months, but she's been charged, and until it's resolved, she can't conduct business in the territory." "What about all the leases?" Harriet asked. She was 14 now, and she asked the question with the focused practicality of someone who had been following the legal situation with genuine attention. "Reyes says the fraudulent ones will be formally voided as part of the prosecution. The families will get clean title to what was theirs." He folded the telegraph. "The ones that were legitimate will be reviewed and renegotiated. Without Hale in operation, the grain storage facility will likely pass to a receiver. There's a consortium of cooperative families bidding to purchase it." "Are we part of that?" Clara asked. "We are." Clara nodded as if she'd expected this answer, which she probably had, since she had been sitting in on the cooperative's financial planning meetings for 6 months now, and had recently produced, unprompted, a 3-page analysis of what the grain storage acquisition would cost, against what it would save over 5 years, written in her small, careful hand and containing one arithmetic error that she'd corrected herself before anyone else found it. She was 9 years old. Evelyn thought about what she would be at 25, and the thought was something between pride and something larger and more complicated. The feeling you get when you understand that a person has a future you will only see part of. After breakfast, when the children scattered to their various occupations, Thomas to the new barn, which had been framed and roofed the previous fall and was now being finished inside, Nate to the pasture with Gil, the younger ones to their lessons. Colton found Evelyn at the east window with the telegraph in his hand. 11 counts, she said. 11. Reyes thinks she'll negotiate rather than go to trial. He says the documentation is too clean. He told me the same. He stood beside her at the window. Outside, the spring was doing what spring did out here, arriving in pieces, patches of green appearing in the brown grass, the creek running high and silver through the valley floor. "Ruth Peters cried when I told her," he said. "I stopped there on the way back from the telegraph office." She looked at him. She said she'd been on that land for 18 years, and she'd never been certain it was actually hers. He paused. 18 years of building something on ground you weren't sure was solid. She understood that. She thought she understood it differently than he did, and also the same way. There was a version of it she'd been living herself. The particular experience of putting work and care into a place you weren't sure would keep you, building something with your hands on ground that hadn't been confirmed yet as ground you were allowed to stand on. "It's hers now," Evelyn said. "Yes." He looked at the valley for a moment, then, "Evelyn?" She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at her with that direct, unhurried attention that had become one of the fixed things of her life over the past year, as reliable as the east window and the breakfast table and Rose's voice in the yard. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, which means I've been thinking about how to do it for about 3 months. 3 months is a long time to think," she said. "I'm a slow thinker." "You're not, actually.
On this particular subject I have been. He was not a man who was comfortable with this kind of conversation. She knew that, had always known it, and it was part of why she valued it, because he was doing it anyway. I know what you came here for. A job. Somewhere to go after Harlan. And I know what you stayed for because you told me, the children, the valley, the work that needed doing. He paused. I'm asking you to stay for something else. For me. For this. All of it. The ranch and the children and the cooperative and everything that comes next. Another pause. I'm asking you to marry me. She stood at the east window of the kitchen that her first morning here had changed, and she thought about the woman she had been when she'd knocked on the front door of this house. Tired, carefully hoping, prepared to work hard and expect little. She thought about how wrong she'd been in that last part, about how much harder it was to receive things than to provide them, about how long it had taken her to stop being surprised that she was still here, that she was wanted here, that the ground had held. Yes, she said. It came out without the layer of qualification she'd have put around it a year ago, and she was glad. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she recognized now, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it, warmer than his face usually ran. Just yes, he said. Was there more you needed? No, he said. No, that's sufficient. She did smile at that, and he did too, and it was not a cinematic moment. There was flour on her apron, and he was holding a telegraph about a fraud indictment. And outside the window, Thomas was yelling something at Nate about the fence post alignment, and Rose was producing a sustained monologue about a beetle she had found. But it was real, which was the only thing that had ever mattered to her. The trial of Veronica Hale took place the following autumn, and it went the way Reyes had predicted. She negotiated. The final agreement involved guilty pleas on 7 of the 11 counts, restitution payments to the affected families totaling an amount that no one had expected to see, and permanent prohibition from commercial activity in the territory. Her empire, the supply network, the leases, the buyer arrangements, the grain storage facility that the cooperative purchased at the court-supervised auction for a price that represented, as Clara informed the cooperative's management meeting, a 23% discount to fair market value, came apart not with any dramatic collapse, but with the slow, unglamorous deflation of a structure that had been built on pressure rather than foundation. Marcus Dray resigned from the Territorial Land Office without explanation 3 days after the plea agreement was announced. Justice Corby announced he would not seek reappointment at the end of his term. These things happen quietly, without ceremony, the way the last evidence of a structure disappears once the structure is gone. Evelyn heard about the plea agreement on a Wednesday morning from Colton, who had the telegraph. She was making bread and she read the message with floury hands and set it on the table. 7 counts, she said. 7 counts, full restitution, permanent bar. He sat down. It's done. She looked at the telegraph. She thought about what it had taken to get to this piece of paper. The letters she'd written, the meetings in the lantern light, the families who had been afraid and done it anyway, the records preserved in kitchen drawers for 18 years, the journalist and the lawyer and the investigator, and before all of that, the scrambled eggs on a cold morning and a gate hinge and a window that let in the morning light. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Like it took too long, she said. Those families spent years being managed and diminished and made to feel like they were wrong about their own circumstances. That doesn't go away because of a plea agreement. No, he said, it doesn't. But she picked up the telegraph and looked at it again. It won't happen again. Not here. Not like this. She set it down. That's something. It's a lot, he said. She went back to the bread. They were married in November, when the valley had gone to its winter colors, and the new barn stood finished at the back of the property, solid and larger than the old one, with a weather vane on the peak that Thomas had made himself from scrap iron, shaped into a running horse that was not quite anatomically correct, but was recognizably a horse, and had been fashioned with the stubborn precision of someone who refused to settle for approximation. The ceremony was at the ranch, in the parlor, with the cooperative families filling the house and the yard, and spilling out onto the porch in their good clothes. And a judge from the county seat named Wharton, who was not the same man as Corby and who had no outstanding obligations to anyone in the valley. Ruth Peters had made 2 pies. Elspeth Randall had brought her fiddle, which no one had known she played, and which she produced at the appropriate moment with the matter-of-fact competence she applied to all things. Evelyn wore a dress that Louisa had helped her alter. They had spent 3 evenings in Louisa's room with the fabric and the pins, talking while they worked in the way people sometimes talk more honestly when their hands are occupied with something else. Louisa was 17 now and had begun writing, which she had told Evelyn about quietly and which Evelyn had received the way it had been offered, as something private that was being trusted to her. "Are you nervous?" Louisa had asked on the last evening of the alterations, biting a thread. "A little," Evelyn said. "Are you?" Louisa looked up. "Why would I be nervous?" "I don't know. New arrangement. Things changing." Louisa considered this. "Things changed a long time ago," she said. "This is just the part where it gets an official date." She looked back at the hem. "Mama would have liked you," she said. "She would have found you interesting." Evelyn had not said anything to that. She had held it. At the ceremony, Rose, who was 4 now, and had developed the confident self-possession of a child who understood that she was deeply, reliably loved, stood beside Evelyn and held her hand with the gravity of someone performing an official function. She had been told she could hold the ring, which she had taken extremely seriously, and she produced it at the correct moment with a focused ceremony that drew a laugh from the assembled families that Rose received with dignified composure. Colton took the ring from his youngest daughter's hand and looked at Evelyn and said the words that Judge Wharton gave him, and then he said something that was not in any script. "You came here for a job. You stayed for everything else. I'm grateful every day that you didn't know when to leave." She had planned to be composed. She was not entirely composed, but that was all right. The Clearwater Valley Cooperative did not transform overnight. There was no moment when all the accumulated damage of 20 years simply lifted, and the land and the people on it were restored to some original condition of ease and plenty. That is not how recovery works, and anyone who has lived through a long difficulty knows that the end of the difficulty does not feel like the beginning of something uncomplicated. It feels like ground that is still soft in places, that needs careful walking, that will need time and sun and the right conditions to firm up properly. What the cooperative did was more modest and more durable than transformation. It gave the families a structure that belonged to them, that they had built, that functioned because they had chosen to make it function. The grain storage facility, purchased at auction, managed by a board that included, within 2 years, Clara Hayes at 13 as the youngest bookkeeper in the territory's recorded commercial history, allowed families to bring their harvests in without surrendering a disproportionate share of them to the monopoly price. The collective purchasing eliminated the supply markups that had been quietly extracting income for years. The shared labor arrangements meant that a family facing illness or accident or simple misfortune did not face it in isolation. None of this was dramatic. Most of it was boring in the way that functional systems are boring. Grain recorded and stored, prices negotiated, labor shared, accounts kept. But boring was exactly what these families had needed. They had had enough drama. They wanted ordinary years, and gradually, that is what they got. Evelyn sat with the cooperative's ledgers once a week in the study that had once been Colton's refuge from the world, which had become, over the course of a year, the room where the actual work of the valley happened. Clara usually sat across from her, doing her own section of the accounts with the focused discipline of a child who had decided that numbers were interesting, which was a decision Evelyn deeply respected. On one such afternoon, in the second spring after the trial, Clara looked up from her work and said, "Ruth Peters told me you wrote the first letters, before there was even a cooperative." Evelyn looked up. "She told you that?" "She said you wrote to the newspapers before anyone else in the valley had decided to do anything." Clara had the look she got when she was assembling information into a picture. "Was that scary?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I didn't know if anyone would listen. I didn't know if anything would come of it." "But you did it anyway." "I did." "Why?" She set down her pen. "Because not doing it felt worse than doing it and failing." She looked at Clara, 9 years old, 10 now, with her creek green eyes and the small, precise movements of someone who had been paying attention since before she understood what she was paying attention to. When you see something wrong, and you have any ability at all to push against it, not pushing is a choice too. It just doesn't feel like one because it's the choice that asks nothing of you. She paused. I found that the choices that ask nothing of you are usually the ones that cost the most in the long run. Clara looked at this for a moment. Then she went back to her accounts. Later, Evelyn thought about how to describe what the valley had taught her. Not in the large, clean terms that made good speeches, but in the terms she actually meant. She had come here with nowhere particularly to go, with a set of practical skills and a habit of not looking away from things that needed attention. She had not arrived as anyone's savior. She had arrived as a housekeeper who could cook breakfast and keep accounts and look at a gate hinge and understand that it needed fixing. What she had found was not a valley waiting to be rescued. It was a valley full of people who had the capability and the will to fix their own problems, who had been systematically prevented from using those capabilities by a structure designed to keep them dependent and divided. Her contribution, if she was honest about it, if she stripped away everything that sounded more significant than it was, had been to connect people who needed to be connected, to hold information that needed to be shared, and to stay when it would have been easier to go. That was it. That was the whole of it. She thought about how many times she had been underestimated by Mrs. Alcott's hotel owner, by the women in Millhaven who had believed the story Hale's niece spread through the school, by Hale herself, who had assessed her as temporary and manageable and had been wrong on both counts. She had felt for most of her adult life like someone standing in a waiting room, capable of things, aware of the capability, uncertain of whether she would ever be in a room where that capability was actually wanted. She had stopped waiting. That maybe was the simplest way to put it. At some point she had stopped waiting to be invited to be useful, and had simply been useful, and the rest had followed from that, imperfectly and slowly and with more setbacks than she had expected, but also more than she had expected. Yeah. Colton Hayes planted a kitchen garden the following spring, which surprised everyone, including himself. It had started because Rose had wanted to grow something, and he had taken her to the seed catalog and let her choose. And what she had chosen was an ambitious and largely impractical selection of vegetables that required more garden space than Rose had initially imagined. Colton had found himself, on a Saturday morning in early March, turning soil in the south side of the yard, with Rose providing supervisory guidance and Thomas, who had appeared without being asked, handling the heavier work. By the end of that first morning, Nate had joined them, and by early afternoon, Clara was there with a diagram she had drawn of how the bed should be arranged for optimal sunlight, which Clara insisted was based on scientific reasoning and which was probably correct. Louisa came out at some point and didn't help with the digging but sat on the fence rail and watched with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was writing about in her mind. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. She had not planned this. She had not engineered this the way she had engineered other things over the past year and a half. She had simply been at the window when it happened, and she had watched a man she loved work in the dirt with his children, all 7 of them present in the same place at the same time without anyone being afraid of what would happen next. And she had understood, not for the first time but in a way that was final and clear, that this was what it looked like when something broken healed. Not spectacular, not complete in the way that implied the damage had never been there, but real and alive and going forward. Colton looked up from the turned soil and saw her in the window and raised a hand. She raised hers in return. Rose, noticing this exchange, waved both arms at Evelyn with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who did not yet understand the concept of a restrained gesture, and then immediately redirected her attention to an earthworm she had found, which she informed Thomas was her worm and was not to be disturbed. "It's a worm," Thomas said. "My worm," Rose said with finality. Thomas looked at the sky with the expression of a 14-year-old who had accepted that some arguments were simply not worth having. Evelyn turned back to the kitchen. There were accounts to finish and a letter to write to Aldridge about the cooperative's next quarter, and a shirt of Nate's that needed a button and dinner to start in an hour. The ordinary work of a life. The work that is never finished and never meant to be, that simply continues as long as the people doing it continue, adding up to something that cannot be measured in any single piece but is legible across the full length of it as a life that was lived facing the right direction. She thought about the woman she had been on the morning she arrived. Standing at the front door of a cold house with one good bag, nobody to meet her, 7 children somewhere inside waiting for her to quit.
She thought about what she had believed in that moment, about what she was and what she was worth, and what she could reasonably expect.
She had been wrong, it turned out, about all of it. She was worth more and capable of more, and the world was willing to offer more than she had allowed herself to expect. That lesson, she thought, was the hardest one and the most important one, and it was the one that nobody could teach you. You had to arrive at it yourself, usually through the door of doing something difficult without any guarantee it would work, usually by refusing to leave when leaving would have been the easier choice. The valley had not made her brave. She had come with whatever bravery she had. The valley had simply been large enough and needed enough to give that bravery somewhere to go. And in going, in staying, which was its own kind of going, its own kind of forward motion, she had found herself at the end of a year she had not been able to predict, standing in a kitchen that smelled of bread and coming spring, with a family she had not been born into but had helped put back together, on ground that was finally, firmly, unambiguously hers. Not because anyone had given it to her, because she had stayed long enough to earn it, and because when the door had been opened by a small girl with careful eyes on a cold morning, she had walked through it, and she had not walked back out. That was all. That was everything.